He saddled the horse before dawn. That was the detail Elowen Price would never stop turning over in her mind. Years later, when the worst of the grief had finally worn down to something she could carry. Gideon's had saddled the horse before dawn, quiet as a man with a secret, while she lay exhausted in the back of the wagon with 6-month-old Toby pressed against her chest. She had heard him moving around outside. She had thought he was checking the wheel. He was not checking the wheel. He had known about the wheel for 2 days. Before we go any further, if stories like this one find you, stories about ordinary people who got knocked all the way down and then decided to get back up, anyway, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss one. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if something in this moves you, tap that like button. Costs you nothing, and it means everything. Now stay with me. Because what happens to Elowen Price in the next few hours is something nobody should ever have to survive alone. The wheel broke on a Tuesday. That was what they called it afterward. The people who were there, the wagon master, the Hendersons from Ohio, the Pelham family with their 7 children stuffed into a Conestoga like seeds in a pod. They called it Tuesday, as though naming the day gave the disaster some kind of border, some edge where it stopped and regular life began again. But for Elowen Price, there was no regular life waiting on the other side of Tuesday. There was only the sound of splintering wood and Gideon's voice saying, very calmly, well, done it. She had been awake since before first light, nursing Toby in the cramped half-dark of the wagon bed, listening to the wind coming down off the mountains in long, low rushes that made the canvas walls breathe in and out like something alive. September in Montana was not like September anywhere she had come from. September in Montana was a warning. The sky that morning had been the specific gray of old pewter, heavy and close, and 2 of the draft horses had been restless since the night before, pulling at their tethers and rolling their eyes at nothing Elowen could see. Animals knew things. She had grown up on her uncle's farm in Pennsylvania, and she understood that much about animals. They knew things. She had said something to Gideon about it. She had said, the horses are nervous. Sky looks bad, and Gideon had looked at her the way he had developed a habit of looking at her in the 14 months of their marriage patient on the surface. Something else underneath and said, Elowen. The wagon master says we push through. We push through. So they pushed through. 31 wagons in a line, moving west through a valley that narrowed as it climbed, the ground soft from 3 days of rain, the wagon wheels cutting ruts in the mud that got deeper with every hour. Toby had fussed most of the morning, and Elowen had held him against her shoulder and walked beside the wagon instead of riding in it, partly to give him the motion that seemed to settle him, and partly because sitting still while the world felt that unstable made her chest tight with something she could not name. She sang to him. She sang the only song she actually knew all the words to, a hymn her grandmother had sung, and Toby had finally dropped his head against her collarbone and gone slack with sleep, his small fist curled around a fold of her dress, trusting her completely in the way that infants trust their mothers with no evidence whatsoever, just pure animal faith. She felt the wheel go before she heard it. A shudder ran through the ground, and then there was the crack not like a gunshot, lower than that, more like a tree giving up in a windstorm, and the whole rear left corner of the wagon dropped. Not all the way to the ground, about 8 inches, enough to tilt everything inside. Enough to send Gideon's box of tools sliding hard against the left wall and bring a sack of cornmeal down off the shelf with a muffled thud. Toby startled awake and began to cry. Elowen stood there in the mud with her baby against her shoulder and looked at the broken wheel and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the wind. Could not have told you what it was exactly. Not fear. She had been afraid plenty of times in her life, and it felt different from this. This was more like recognition, like something she had been carrying without knowing the weight of it had finally settled and made itself known. Gideon climbed down from the wagon seat and crouched by the wheel and said, well, that's done it. The wagon master was a man named August Ferris, somewhere in his late 50s, with a beard that had gone completely white and the permanently squinted expression of a man who had spent 30 years looking into wind. He came back along the line when word reached him, moving fast for a man his age, and he crouched beside Gideon, and they both looked at the wheel in silence for a moment that stretched out uncomfortably. Ferris said, No, Gideon said, just the wheel. But she's finished. 3 spokes clean through and the rims split. Ferris stood up and rubbed his jaw. He looked at the sky. He looked at the mountains ahead. He looked at the line of wagons behind them, already stacking up, horses stamping and blowing. I got a spare rim at the back of the supply wagon, he said. But I don't have the time or the weather to do this right. Sky is going to open up inside 2 hours. I can fix it, Gideon said. Ferris looked at him. In 2 hours. Give me 3. I don't have 3. There was a silence. The wind came down off the ridge in a long cold sheet, and Elowen tightened her hold on Toby and thought about her grandmother's farm in winter, the way the cold came in under the door no matter how you packed it, and she thought, this is a moment that matters. This is one of those moments. She could feel it the way you feel a shift in pressure before lightning. We'll catch up, Gideon said. We've done it before. Not in this weather, Ferris said. But he was already looking back at his wagon train at the 30 families waiting on him, and Elowen understood the calculation he was doing. It was not a cruel calculation, it was simply math. 30 families against 1. Winter against delay. Survival was a numbers problem out here, and she was on the wrong side of the equation. The wagon master gave them the spare rim and his 2 most experienced men for 90 minutes. That was what he said, 90 minutes. And he said it looking at Gideon, not at Elowen, which was the way most men in the wagon train talked about most things. Like she was a piece of furniture that Gideon happened to be transporting west. 2 men worked fast, and Gideon worked alongside them, and Elowen kept Toby fed and dry inside the wagon, and heated a tin of beans on the small camp stove because nobody had eaten since before dawn. She handed the beans out through the canvas flap without being asked. None of the 3 men thanked her, but they ate fast and handed the tin back empty, which she supposed was close enough. The sky opened up at the 60-minute mark. Not gradually. Not with any warning beyond a single low rumble from somewhere back behind the mountains. One moment it was dry, or dry enough, just cold and close and threatening. The next moment the rain was coming straight down in the kind of sheets you walk into like a wall, and the temperature dropped so fast, Elowen felt it in her back teeth. Toby had been drowsing, and the sound woke him, and he started up that thin, wavering cry that meant he was cold, not hungry, not frightened exactly, just deeply and fundamentally unhappy about the state of the world. She could hear August Ferris outside. She could hear him talking to Gideon in that flat final voice of a man who has made up his mind and has the authority to make it stick. She could not hear the words over the rain and Toby's crying, but she did not need to. She knew from the sound of it. She had spent 14 months listening to conversations that excluded her, and she had learned to read their shapes. She put Toby down on the blankets, just for a moment, and she pushed through the canvas flap and stood in the rain and said, "How much longer?" Both men looked at her. Ferris, with something that might have been pity if it weren't so buried under pragmatism. Gideon was something harder to name. "Wheel's done," Gideon said, "but the storm's too bad to move tonight. Ferris is going to push on. He's going to push on," Elowen repeated. Ferris took his hat off in the rain, which was a habit of his when he was talking to a woman, and he put it back on immediately because the rain was heavy enough to be painful. "Mrs. Price, I cannot hold 30 families in this weather. I am sorry for your situation, I truly am." "Our situation," Elowen said. "Yes, ma'am. Can someone stay back with us?" Ferris said nothing. "One family," she said, "one wagon." He was already shaking his head, not unkindly, just definitively. "I cannot ask that of anyone. We'll send word from the next town. There's a settlement 20 miles on. I'll send a man back for you when the storm breaks." "And when will that be?" He looked at the sky. He did not answer. One by one the wagons moved past. The Hendersons, who had shared their salt pork with her back in Wyoming when she ran out. Pelham family, and the youngest Pelham girl, 8 years old, pressed her face against the canvas and waved at Elowen through the rain with a small, helpless wave that Elowen would remember for a long time afterward. Then the supply wagon, the livestock wagon, the 3 unmarried men who kept to themselves. Then August Ferris himself, on his black horse, moving past without looking back, already watching the mountain pass ahead, with the focused attention of a man who knows exactly what he can afford to feel. And then they were gone. Just gone. As if they had never been there at all. As if the wagon train was something Elowen had imagined, And now there was only the rain and the broken wheel, and Toby crying inside the wagon, and the mountains closing in from every direction, and the particular silence of being the only people in a very large and entirely indifferent landscape. Gideon stood by the wheel for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm going to ride ahead. Find the settlement. Maybe there's a tool there I need, or a man who can help." Elowen looked at him. Something in her face must have said what she was thinking, because something shifted in his, just for a moment, just a flicker of something that might have been guilt, or might have been impatience. It was too fast to read, and then he was already moving to the horse. "Take the rifle," she said. He took the rifle, Gideon. She set it to his back. "How long?" "A few hours," he said without turning around. "Keep the stove going, keep Toby warm." He rode east. She thought he was going east, because that was where the settlement was, the one Ferris had mentioned, and that made sense, riding toward help. It was only later, much later, when the light was completely gone and the storm had settled in over them like something permanent, like something that had always been there and always would be, that she realized he had ridden east, but the settlement was west. The settlement Ferris mentioned was 20 miles west, in the direction the wagon train had gone. She did not let herself understand that right away. She kept the stove going. She changed Toby and wrapped him in the driest blanket she could find, and fed him and held him and sang the hymn again and listened to the rain. She waited. Outside, the temperature dropped. She could feel it even through the canvas, even with the small stove burning, the particular aggressive cold of a mountain storm settling in for the night. She had checked the firewood twice. They had maybe 4 hours of fuel, maybe less. And the stove was small and the wagon was not built for this kind of cold. And Toby's nose was already running, and his hands were cool when she held them. And she was doing the arithmetic now, the same way Ferris had done it. Except her numbers were different. Her numbers were degrees and hours, and the amount of warmth a 6-month-old body could generate before it stopped generating warmth. An hour passed. 2 hours. She opened the canvas flap and looked out into nothing. The rain was so heavy she could barely see the broken wheel. And beyond that, there was only dark. No lights. No sound except wind and water. No hoofbeats coming back. She let herself understand it then. She let herself sit with it for exactly 30 seconds, which was as long as she could afford. And then she put it somewhere. She could not feel it for the moment. And she started to think. The money was in the box under the driver's seat. She knew that. $73. Everything they had, saved over 2 years. She climbed out through the front of the wagon in the rain, soaked through in about 4 seconds, and she felt under the seat for the box. The box was there. It was empty. She sat on the driver's bench in the rain with the empty box in her lap, and she thought, he took the money. He took the horse. He took the rifle. He packed the box before he saddled the horse, before dawn, before the wheel broke, before the storm. He was packed before any of this happened. He knew about the wheel. He had known for 2 days. Inside the wagon, Toby was beginning to cry again, a different cry now. The slow, tired one that scared her more than the sharp, urgent ones. The one that meant he was too cold and too exhausted to work up to real distress anymore. She climbed back through the canvas, and she picked him up, and she pressed his face against her neck, and she felt the coolness of his skin, and she felt the coolness of his skin, and she thought, with the extraordinary clarity of someone who has run completely out of options, I am going to have to make a decision right now, and whatever I decide is going to be permanent. She could stay. She had 4 hours of fuel maybe, and then nothing. The temperature was still dropping. She could walk. 2 miles of visibility in this storm was optimistic. 1 mile was probably more accurate, and she would be carrying Toby and the cold, and she had no idea what direction to walk. She was still holding the empty box. She put it down. She was wrapping Toby in every layer she could find, the good wool blanket, her own coat over the top, his knit cap pulled down as far as it would go when she heard it. Underneath the rain, underneath the wind. She heard something that might have been hoofbeats, or might have been her own need, making itself into a sound, and she sat completely still, and she listened, and it came again, and this time she was sure. Someone was riding toward them. She did not feel relieved. She felt afraid, which was honest alone in a storm. No money, no rifle, a baby in her arms, and a stranger riding up in the dark was not automatically good news, and she understood that in her bones. She held Toby against her chest with both arms, and she pushed through the canvas, and she stood in the rain and she waited. And out of the dark came a horse and a man she had never seen before. He pulled up about 10 feet from the wagon. He was big, or seemed big on horseback in the dark, wide across the shoulders, wearing an oilskin coat that had the particular battered quality of something that had been rained on 100 times. He had a hat pulled low, and she could barely see his face. He looked at the wagon, at the broken wheel, at her standing in the rain, holding her baby. He said, "Where's your husband?" She said, "Gone." There was a pause, just the rain between them. "Gone how?" he said. "Gone, gone," she said. "He's not coming back." He looked at her for a long moment. She could not see his eyes, but she could feel the assessment in it, the same way you feel someone looking at you in a dark room. Then he looked at the baby in her arms. "You can't stay here," he said. "I know that," she said. "I've got a ranch 2 miles south. It's not much, but it's dry and it's warm." He paused. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just telling you what there is." She stood in the rain with Toby against her chest, and she looked at this stranger, and she thought about everything that could go wrong with trusting a strange man in the dark. She thought about it thoroughly and honestly, and she arrived at the same answer. Every time it did not matter. Because the thing that was certain, the cold, the empty box, the 4 hours of fuel, Toby's hands growing cooler against her palms, that thing was worse than the thing that might happen. She had always made careful decisions. She had married carefully, chosen carefully, followed the rules of careful women, and here she was, standing in a Montana storm, abandoned. Careful had not worked all right, she said. He reached down from the horse. Not for her, for Toby. He held out his hands. She hesitated. "You'll need both arms to mount," he said. "I'll give him back the moment you're up." It was such a practical thing to say. Not reassuring, not gentle, not charming. Just practical. She handed Toby to him, and he held the baby against his chest with one arm, matter-of-factly, like he'd done it before, and he waited while she mounted behind him, and then he passed Toby back to her without comment. She held Toby against her chest and held onto the back of the stranger's coat with her other hand, and they rode into the dark. The ranch materialized out of the rain, slowly alight first, just a yellow smear in the dark, then the shape of a building, then the specific smell of livestock and hay and wood smoke that she would, for the rest of her life, associate with that particular rush of relief, the kind that comes not from safety itself, but from the first moment your body believes that safety is possible. He dismounted and held the horse. "Go on inside," he said. "Doors unlocked. Stoves banked, but there's wood." She stood in the doorway with Toby, and she looked back at him in the rain, and she said, "What's your name?" "Ronan Hale," he said. "Elwyn Price," she said. "This is Toby." He nodded once, like this was information he was filing away for later. Then he turned to take the horse to the barn, and she went inside, and the door swung shut behind her, and for the first time in hours, she was out of the rain. She stood in the middle of his kitchen, and she listened to the storm outside, and she looked at the cold stove, and the stack of dry wood beside it, and the shelf with its row of tins, and the table with its 2 chairs. And she thought, this is the whole world right now. This room. This is it. She put Toby down on the floor on top of her coat just for a moment, and she knelt in front of the stove, and she started to build the fire. Her hands were shaking badly. It took her 4 tries to get the match to catch. When it finally did, she sat back on her heels and watched the flame take hold, and she thought about the empty box, and about Gideon's voice saying, "Keep the stove going, keep Toby warm," and about 31 wagons disappearing into the rain, and she thought, "I am 24 years old, and I have nothing left, and somewhere a man I married is riding east with $73 and my rifle, and I am sitting on a stranger's floor in Montana building a fire with shaking hands." The fire caught. The warmth started, slowly, the way warmth always starts tentatively, like it's not sure it's welcome. Toby reached toward it with both hands, his face changing, and Elwyn watched him, and she felt something shift in herself that she would not be able to name for a long time. Later she would call it the moment she stopped, waiting to be rescued. But that night, she just called it still alive, and that was enough. She woke up not knowing where she was. That was the first thing. The ceiling was wrong. Too low, too dark, the smell of pine sap and old wool instead of canvas and river mud. Then Toby stirred against her side, and she remembered everything in the space of about 2 seconds. The way you remember a thing that is so large it needs a moment to fit itself back into your body. The storm, the wheel, the empty box, the man on horseback coming out of the dark. She lay still and listened. The rain had stopped. She could hear wind still, but distant now, moved off toward the eastern mountains. Underneath it, she could hear something else, the sound of an axe. Steady, rhythmic, unhurried. Someone splitting wood in the early morning like it was just another day, because for him, she supposed it was. Toby was awake, watching the ceiling with the serious expression he always wore first thing in the morning, like he was solving a problem. She pressed her lips to his forehead. Warm, not feverish, just warm. His hands, when she took them, were dry and pink, and she held them for a long moment and felt something in her chest unknot itself just slightly, just enough to breathe around. She sat up. Ronan Hale's bedroom was small and plain. A bed with an iron frame, a chest of drawers with a water basin on top, a single window with heavy curtains that let in a thin line of gray morning light. No pictures on the walls, no decorative anything. The room of a man who spent very little time in it and had stopped caring about the parts of life that required decoration somewhere along the way. There was a hook on the back of the door with a spare shirt on it and a pair of wool socks folded over the shirt, and she thought, he put those there for me. Not a note, not an explanation. Just dry socks on a hook. She changed Toby on the bed, using the last of the clean cloth she'd had stuffed in her coat pocket, and she pulled on her own dress, still damp at the hem and cuffs, and she put the wool socks on because her feet were cold, and because refusing them would have been a kind of pride she couldn't afford this morning. Then she picked up Toby, and she went out to find the kitchen. He was already inside by the time she got there, standing at the stove with his back to her, pouring coffee from a blackened pot into 2 tin mugs. He had not heard her come in, or if he had, he didn't show it. He set both mugs on the table and turned around and saw her standing in the doorway with Toby on her hip, and he said, "Sleep all right?" "Yes," she said. "Thank you for the room." "Only room with a door that closes," he said. "Seemed like you needed it." He sat down at the table and pulled one of the mugs toward himself and nodded at the other one. "Coffee's strong. I don't know how to make it any other way." She sat down. The coffee was very strong and very hot, and she wrapped both hands around the mug and she thought, this is the strangest morning of my life. And she had had some strange mornings. Toby reached for the mug and she moved it out of his range, and he made his displeasure known in the direct and uncomplicated way of infants, and for just a second she thought she saw something move across Ronan Hale's face, not a smile exactly. More like the memory of one, the shape a smile leaves, after it's been gone for a long time. "How old?" he said. 6 months last week." He nodded. He looked at his coffee. "I need to figure out what I'm doing," Elowen said, because she thought it was important to say that clearly, right at the start, before either of them could get comfortable with an arrangement that had no name. "I'm not asking to stay, I just need to think." "Storm's moved off," he said. "Roads will be mud for a few days. You're not going anywhere today regardless. I understand that. I'm saying I'm not asking to stay past that." He looked at her then, directly, for the first time in the light where she could actually see his face. He was older than she'd thought, mid-30s maybe, with the kind of weathered quality that wasn't age exactly, but the accumulation of outdoor years. A scar along the left side of his jaw, old and pale. Dark eyes, careful in the way of a man who had learned that most things required more watching than talking. "I didn't say you were," he said. "I know. I'm saying it anyway." He regarded her for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee. "All right," he said. "Say it however many times you need to." That was the end of that conversation, apparently. He finished his coffee and stood and put on his coat and went back outside. And most of its windows were dark, and Elowen sat at the table with Toby and looked around the kitchen in the thin morning light and started to take stock of what she actually had. It was not much. She had the clothes she'd been wearing. She had Toby. She had the small purse in her coat pocket with 62 cents in it, which was the change from a purchase she'd made 2 days ago and had not yet put back in the main money box, a detail so small, so accidental, that she kept turning it over. 62 cents. That was what Gideon had missed. That was what he'd left her. She did not know whether to be furious or grateful that it existed at all. She had no horse, no rifle, no wagon, or no wagon worth anything without a full repair she couldn't afford. She had no way to contact the wagon train and no particular reason to think anyone on it would come back for her regardless. She had no family west of Pennsylvania and no money to get back there. She had an infant who would need to eat every few hours for the foreseeable future. What she had, she thought, was a kitchen table and 62 cents, and the fact of still being alive. She started with the kitchen table. There was food in the pantry, dried beans, salt pork, a sack of flour, some tins, a half-empty jar of lard, a rope of dried onions hanging from a nail. Enough for a while if managed carefully. She had always been careful about food. Growing up on her uncle's farm had taught her that food was time, and time was what you were always running out of. She found a pot, filled it from the water barrel, hung it over the fire, and started breakfast. She was not sure what the protocol was for cooking in someone else's kitchen. She was not sure there was a protocol for this situation at all. She decided she would make enough for two and put Ronan's portion on the stove to keep warm. And if he didn't want it, at least she had tried. He came in an hour later, smelling of cold air and horses and pine, and he saw the pot on the stove and the bowl set out on the table, and he stopped in the doorway for a second, just a second. Then he came in and sat down and he ate, and he said, "Thank you." And he meant it the way a person means it when they're not used to having anything to thank someone for. Flat and simple and real. She said, "I found the chickens." He looked up. 3 of them, she said. "They're back behind the woodpile. Storm scattered them. I think there are more, but they went further." "There are 8 total," he said. Or were. "I'll find the rest," she said. After Toby goes down for his morning sleep, he looked at her like he was trying to figure out what kind of person she was, which was fair because she was trying to figure out the same thing. She was not, as it turned out, the kind of person who sat still in a strange man's kitchen and waited for someone to tell her what to do next. She was finding that out in real time. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to anyway." He went back to his food. After a moment, without looking up, he said, 2 more might be in the feed shed. The door blows open in high wind. "I'll check there first," she said. That was how it started. Not with any kind of agreement. Not with terms or arrangements or discussions about what was expected of whom. Just 2 people in a kitchen after a storm, eating breakfast and talking about chickens, and then getting up and doing what needed to be done. She found 6 of the 8 chickens. 2 were not going to be found, which she told Ronan that evening with the matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering information and not looking for sympathy, and he nodded and said, "6 is fine. 6 is more than I expected." She wasn't sure if he meant more than he expected from the storm or more than he expected from her, and she didn't ask. The days that followed had a shape that she hadn't anticipated. Ronan Hale was not what she would have expected from a man who lived alone on an isolated Montana ranch. She had expected roughness, or silence used as aggression, or the particular entitled quality of a man who had gotten used to having no one around to consider but himself. She had known men like that. She had been married to one in the end, or a version of one. Ronan was rough in the physical sense, his hands, his pace, the way he went at work like it was something to be defeated, but he was not rough in the way that cost her anything. He was quiet, but not hostilely so. He simply did not talk unless he had something to say, which was more unusual than she would have thought, and, she was surprised to find, more restful than the alternative. Gideon had always been talking. Gideon had always been explaining and arguing and performing some version of himself or for whatever audience happened to be present, and she had spent 14 months trying to be the right kind of audience and failing at it in ways she hadn't fully understood until now. Ronan said what he meant. When he didn't like something, he said so plainly and without theater. When he appreciated something, same. It was disorienting, and then it was clarifying, and then it was, quietly, one of the most useful things anyone had ever done for her. On the 4th day, she mended the fence line along the east pasture. She had asked him where the tools were, and he had shown her without asking why she wanted to know. Most of its windows were dark, and she had taken a hammer and a pouch of nails and a length of wire and gone out there in the early afternoon, while Toby slept, and she had looked at the section that had gone down in the storm, and she had thought about it for a few minutes, and then she'd fixed most of it. Some of it she did wrong the first time and had to pull out and do again, and by the time she was done, her hands were raw, and there was a cut on her left thumb from the wire. that she'd wrapped in a strip of cloth from the hem of her underskirt. Ronan found her coming back in as he was coming out, and he looked at her hands and at the wrapped thumb and at the tools in her arms, and he said, "You fenced before?" "No," she said. He looked at the fence line. She couldn't tell from his face whether it was adequate or not. "It'll hold," he said. That was all. But she understood from his tone that holding was the standard, and she had met it. On the 6th day, a man rode up to the ranch. She was in the yard with Toby, hanging laundry on the line Ronan had strung between 2 posts, and she heard the horse before she saw the rider had gotten quick about that. Listening for hoofbeats, the way people who have been left somewhere get quick about listening for hoofbeats, and she turned to see a man she didn't know riding a gray horse up the track. He was older, heavyset, with the kind of prosperous look that announces itself before a man even opens his mouth. The coat a grade better than practical. The horse too fine for utility work. He rode into the yard like he owned it, which he did not, and his windows were dark, and he stopped and looked down at Elowen with that took about 3 seconds as the specific combination of surprise and contempt that certain men produce automatically when they encounter a woman somewhere they didn't expect to find one. "Where's Hale?" he said. "Not hello, not good morning. Just where's Hale?" "He's out in the north field," she said. "Tell him you came by." "I'll wait," the man said, and he dismounted and tied his horse at the post without being invited to, and he stood there in the yard looking at the laundry on the line and at Toby on Elowen's hip and at the house with a slow, assessing scan that made the back of her neck prickle. "I don't know that we've met," she said, because silence with this man felt like concession. "Silas Varden," he said. He did not ask her name. She gave it anyway. "Elowen Price." He looked at her again more carefully this time. "Price," he said. "Where's your husband, Mrs. Price?" "Dead," she said. It was the first time she had said that word out loud, and it landed differently than she expected. Not grief exactly. Something more complicated. There was an accident. Varden looked at her with eyes that were doing math behind them, and she recognized the math because she had watched men do it her whole life, calculating what a woman alone added up to, what she was worth, what she could be made to do. "Hale knows about this," he said. "He was the one who found us," she said. "In the storm." Varden said nothing. He just looked at her with that calculating expression. And then he looked at the house again, and then Ronan was coming across the yard from the direction of the north field. And Elowen watched something change in Varden's face, not the expression. The expression stayed the same, but something underneath it shifted. The way a card player's hands move slightly when the deal goes differently than expected. "Varden," Ronan said. He said it with the tone you use for a person you have known a long time and liked for none of it. "Hale." Varden smiled. "Didn't know you had company." "What do you need?" Ronan said. "Just neighborly," Varden said. "Checking in after the storm. Lost a section of the north-facing fence myself." "You fixed," Ronan said. Varden glanced at Elowen. "Hired some help?" "She's a guest," Ronan said. "Storm left her stranded. Her and her boy. Dead," Ronan said. Same word Elowen had used, same flat delivery. Varden smiled again, and it was a wider smile this time, with something behind it that Elowen couldn't quite identify, except that it made her want to step back, which she did not do. "Well," he said. "That's Christian of you, Hale, taking in strays." Ronan said, "Was there something else you needed?" Varden was already moving back toward his horse. "No," he said. "Just checking in." He untied the horse and mounted in one smooth motion, and he looked at Elowen one more time from up there, from the height of the saddle, and he said, "Mrs. Price, you find yourself in need of anything. You know where Varden land is." He said it pleasantly enough that a person not paying attention might have taken it as kindness. Elowen was paying attention. She said nothing. He rode out. Ronan watched him go with an expression she was starting to read, which was the same expression he wore when he was looking at weather he didn't trust. Then he turned back to the yard, and he saw her still standing there with the laundry half hung, and Toby on her hip. And he said, "You all right?" "Who is he?" she said. Ronan was quiet for a moment. "He owns most of the land east of here. Been trying to buy this parcel for 3 years. He picked up a shirt from the laundry basket and handed it to her, not to be helpful exactly. More like he wanted something to do with his hands while he talked. Every time I say no, he finds a new reason why I should reconsider. And now I'm a new reason," she said. He looked at her. "He's going to tell people," she said. That I'm here. That I'm. She paused, not sure how to finish that, not sure what word applied. Living here. Staying here. Neither of those was exactly right or exactly wrong. Probably, Ronan said. Does that bother you? He thought about it, which she had already learned was his way. He did not answer fast. He answered right. What people think of me has never changed my water rights, he said, or my fence lines, or anything I actually need. He took the shirt back from her and hung it on the line himself, imprecisely, the way a man hangs laundry when he has only ever done it alone. What Varden thinks of you doesn't need to mean anything to you either. It might, she said, if I'm going to live around here. He glanced at her sideways. You planning to, she hadn't said it out loud before then. She wasn't entirely sure she had decided it before then. But she heard herself say, I think I have to. I don't have the money to go back, and I don't have anywhere to go back to. She shifted Toby to her other hip. I need work. I need wages. I need a way to build something that's mine. Ronan hung the last shirt. He looked at the fence line she'd repaired, at the chickens she'd recovered and penned, at the yard that was measurably more ordered than it had been a week ago. Then he said town's 12 miles east, Ash Creek. They've been without a school teacher since May. I have no teaching experience, she said. Do you have an education? Yes. Can you hold your ground with a room full of people who don't want to listen to you? She thought of Gideon, of the wagon train, of Silas Varden on his horse, looking down at her from that prosperous height. Yes, she said. He nodded once. Then you have more qualifications than their last 3 teachers put together. He picked up the empty laundry basket. I can drive you in Thursday. Introduce you to the school board chairman if you want. Man named Aldrich. He's cautious, but he's fair. She looked at him. Why are you helping me? He stopped. He had the basket under his arm, and he was half turned toward the house, and he stopped and he thought about the question with the same deliberate attention he gave everything, and she appreciated that he didn't dismiss it or deflect it with something easy. Once, he said, I rode away from someone who needed help. I had reasons. They were good reasons, the kind that make sense at the time. He looked at something past her shoulder, at the mountains maybe, or at whatever a person looks at when they're seeing something that happened years ago. She died alone. He came back to the present, to the yard, to Elowen. I don't do that anymore. She did not ask who she was. It felt like a door he had opened, just far enough for light to come through, and she was not going to push it wider than he had meant. Thursday, she said. Yes. She went inside to put Toby down for his afternoon sleep, and she sat on the edge of the bed in Ronan's room, with Toby nursing himself into drowsiness against her, and she thought about the school board and about Silas Varden's eyes doing their math, and about Ronan's voice saying she died alone. Most of its windows were dark, and she thought about what it would mean to stand in front of a room full of children who didn't know her and convince them that she knew something worth learning. Terrifying. She was going to do it. News, in the way of small frontier towns, moves faster than horses. By the time Ronan drove her into Ash Creek on Thursday in his wagon, Toby bundled and strapped to her chest in the improvised carrier she'd made from a length of cloth. She was aware that she had already arrived before she arrived. She could feel it in the way people on the main street looked at the wagon as it came down the track. A look with more information in it than a first look at a stranger should contain. The school board met in the back room of the general store, which also served as the room where the town held meetings about water and cattle and road maintenance and every other thing that required men to sit in chairs and disagree with each other. There were 4 of them. Aldrich, who was chairman, a weathered man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a rancher named Burl who said almost nothing the entire time, a shopkeeper named Tate who kept looking at Toby like the baby was a complication he hadn't planned for, and a 4th man, young and nervous, who was introduced as the minister's son and who seemed to have been included on the board mainly to provide moral ballast. Aldrich asked her about her education. She told him. He asked her what she had taught before. She told him the truth, which was nothing, and she watched his face close slightly, and she said, before he could close it all the way, I have no classroom experience. What I have is 8 years of formal education, the ability to speak, read, and write in 2 languages, a working knowledge of arithmetic through algebra, and the fact that I am here and available, and you have had no teacher since May. Tate said, the position requires someone settled, someone the community can vouch for. Who vouched for your last teacher? She said. A pause. He came with references, Tate said. He left in May, Elowen said, which suggests his references were better than his reliability. She was aware this was a risk pushing back at a man with the power to say no. But she had decided, in the wagon on the way here, that she was done performing smallness for the benefit of men who were going to think whatever they were going to think regardless. I am not asking you to trust me without evidence. I am asking you to let me demonstrate what I can do. Give me a trial month. Pay me half wages for the trial. The parents are satisfied at the end of it, we negotiate a full contract. Aldrich looked at her over his glasses. Half wages, he said. Half wages, she said. You lose nothing if I fail. He looked at Ronan, who was standing by the door with his hat in his hands and who, when the chairman looked at him, simply said, "She fixed my east fence in an afternoon." Never fenced before in her life. Nobody in the room quite knew what to do with that information, which was exactly why Ronan had offered it. It was so specific and so strange that it worked like a key in a lock. It said, "This is a real person, doing real things in the real world." Aldrich said, 1 month trial, half wages. You start Monday. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Aldrich." She shook his hand, and Burles, and Tate shook it like he was handling something he wasn't sure was clean, and the minister's sons, and she walked out into the main street of Ash Creek with Toby strapped to her chest. And she stood in the October light, and she breathed. Ronan came out behind her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He looked at her. That almost smile again, the one that was more shape than expression. You told him his last teacher left because his references were better than his reliability. Was that wrong, she said. I have no idea, he said. But he hired you. She looked up the street and down it, at the town that was going to be her. Town now, this rough and impermanent-looking collection of board-front buildings and muddy tracks that someone had named Ash Creek and decided to stake a life on. Did not look like much. She supposed she did not look like much either, standing there with a baby strapped to her chest and mud on her boots and a dress that was still faintly damp at the hem from this morning's walk across Ronan's yard. She was going to teach school here. She was going to earn wages here. She was going to build something here that belonged to her and could not be ridden away from in the night with the money box empty. But first there was the question of where she was going to sleep. The school board had mentioned briefly that there was a room above the general store that the previous teacher had used, but Tate had not offered it, and she had not asked, not wanting to press her luck in that particular meeting. Which meant tonight she was still going back to Ronan Hale's ranch, and next week, when school started, she was going to need somewhere else, and none of that was arranged yet. She was in the process of turning this problem over when a woman came out of the dry goods store across the street and stopped when she saw them. She was somewhere near Elowen's age, broad-shouldered and practical-looking, with the specific look of a woman who has been working since before sunup and expects to be working after sundown and has made her peace with that. She looked at Elowen, she looked at Toby, she looked at Ronan with an expression that seemed to know him, and then back at Elowen. "You the new teacher," she said. Not a question exactly, more like a verification. "Starting Monday," Elowen said. "Heard about you," the woman said. "My daughter's one of yours, Clara Hobbs." "I'm Ruth," Elowen said. "I look forward to having her in class." Ruth Hobbs looked at her steadily for a moment, the way women who have learned to read people quickly look at a new person. Whatever she read, she seemed to have made up her mind about it fast. "Tate's room above the store," she said. "He'll rent it. He just won't offer it because he has to be asked 3 times about everything before he does it." She glanced at Ronan. Could have told her that. "I was working up to it," Ronan said. Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Elowen, come to supper Friday. Bring the boy. I'll introduce you to some of the mothers. You're going to need people on your side before Silas Varden gets done talking about you." Elowen felt the name land. What has he said? What he always says, Ruth said, about anyone who stands between him and something he wants. She looked at Toby again, who had fallen asleep against Elowen's chest with his mouth open and his fist curled around a fold of her coat. Something shifted in her face. Practical women, Elowen was learning, were not unfeeling, they just stored their feeling differently. "You got guts, coming into this town the way you came. I respect that. Come Friday." She went back into the store. Elowen looked at Ronan. "Is she always like that?" she said. "Pretty much," he said. I like her. Most people do, he said once they get past the first 2 minutes. He settled his hat back on his head and turned toward the wagon. We should head back. Storm might come in this afternoon. She fell into step beside him. Toby sleeping against her chest, the mud of Ash Creek's Main Street, pulling at her boots with each step, and she thought about Friday, and about Ruth Hobbs, and about Silas Varden talking about her in rooms she wasn't in, and about Monday and the classroom, and the children she hadn't met yet, who were going to decide, one way or another, whether she was going to survive this. But she was going to find out. On Sunday evening, the night before her first day, she sat at Ronan's kitchen table after Toby was asleep, and she wrote out a lesson plan on the back of a flour sack she'd cut flat. She had a stub of pencil and the flour sack, and Ronan's copy of a worn almanac that she'd asked to borrow, and she worked by lamplight for 2 hours, while Ronan sat across from her doing the ranch accounts in silence, and neither of them talked much, which was fine. At some point, she said without looking up, what were they like? Teachers before. He thought about it. First one was afraid of them, he said. Children can smell fear. Lasted 2 weeks. He turned a page in his account book. Second one hit a boy named Dilly Ferris for not sitting still. Dilly Ferris can't sit still. He's got something wrong with his legs. Everyone in town knows it. Second teacher was gone before the month was out. He made a note in the book. Third one was the one Tate mentioned with the references. Smart enough. Just didn't want to be here. And you think I want to be here, she said. I think you don't have a choice, he said, which is different from wanting to be somewhere, but it makes you work harder. She looked at him across the table. That's not particularly flattering, she said. No, he agreed. But it's accurate. She thought about it. He was right, which was annoying in the specific way that accurate things said plainly are always slightly annoying. She was not here because she had dreamed of teaching school on the Montana frontier. She was here because a wheel had broken, and a man had ridden away, and 62 cents had been enough to stay alive one more night. She was here because of a chain of disasters that had deposited her in this kitchen with this flour sack and this pencil and this stubborn refusal to let the disasters win. It was not a beautiful reason. It was, as Ronan said, accurate. She went back to the lesson plan. Outside, the wind came down off the mountains, the way it always did this time of year, testing things, looking for weaknesses, and the lamp burned steady on the table between them, and Toby slept in the back room making the small sounds that sleeping infants make. And Elowen wrote out the next day's work in her careful hand and told herself, hold your ground. You held the fence. You held the school board. You can hold a classroom. She was not sure she believed it yet. She was going to find out in the morning. The lamp burned for another hour, and neither of them said much, and eventually Ronan closed the account book and said good night and went out to the barn where he slept, because he had given her his room and not taken it back, and she blew out the lamp and sat for a moment in the dark, listening to the wind and to Toby breathing in the other room, and to the absolute silence of a landscape that cared nothing about whether she succeeded or failed. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she slept. Classroom smelled like pine resin and old chalk dust, and something else she couldn't identify at first, a particular closed up, unused smell that told her the room had been empty for months, and nobody had thought to open a window in all that time. She opened 2 of them immediately, even though the morning air was cold enough to see her breath in, because the alternative was spending the day in a room that smelled like abandonment, and she had spent enough time in that particular atmosphere already. There were 14 desks. 11 children came. She had arrived 40 minutes early to set up what she could, which was not much. The chalk was worn down to stubs. The slate boards were scratched and cloudy. The single bookshelf held 7 books in varying states of disintegration, and someone had carved initials into 3 of the desks with what must have been a fairly determined effort. She had arranged the desks in a slight curve rather than straight rows, which she had decided on the night before for no particular reason, except that straight rows felt like she was expecting them to fail, and she was not going to start from that position. She had written her name on the board Miss Price, because she was not going back to Mrs. under any circumstances, and she had stood at the front of the room with her heart doing something complicated in her chest, and she had waited. They came in the way children come into rooms they aren't sure about. Some in pairs, talking to each other and not looking at her. Some alone, looking at everything except her, which was its own kind of looking. A girl of about 7 with her hair in 2 tight braids came in, saw the rearranged desks, stopped dead, and turned around and went back out. And Elowen heard her voice outside saying, she moved the desks. Clara, with the tone of someone reporting a significant development, and then the girl came back in and sat down, still looking at the desk like it had opinions she needed to account for. That must be Clara Hobbs, she thought, Ruth's daughter. The braids were unmistakably the work of a practical woman in a hurry. She was taking the register reading names from the list Aldrich had given her, getting a feel for who was who when the door opened one more time and the last student came in. Late. Not by accident. He was somewhere around 15, tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the doorframe, with Silas Varden's build and Silas Varden's eyes doing Silas Varden's calculations, and he came in and he looked at her, and he looked at the room, and he looked at the seat. She had indicated it with a small gesture. The only empty desk remaining, and he sat in it with the deliberate, unhurried motion of someone establishing that sitting down was his own idea. Nolan Varden, she said from her register. That's right, he said. You're 7 minutes late, Nolan. Clock at home runs slow, he said. Most of its windows were dark. 2 or 3 of the other children made sounds that were not quite laughter, more like the held breath noise of people watching something to see what happens next. Elowen wrote a note beside his name. Not a mark, not a punishment. Just, arrived late, she would need the record. Noted, she said. Now, let's begin. She had thought about how to start for 2 days, and she had decided not to start with reading or arithmetic or any of the things they would expect, because she had read in a book she'd found at the bottom of Ronan's trunk a school teacher's manual. Why he had it, she did not know, and had not asked that the first day established the emotional contract of the classroom, the unspoken agreement between teacher and student about what kind of place this was going to be. She had read that and thought, yes, that's exactly right. And so instead of reading or arithmetic, she said, I'm going to ask each of you a question. The question is, what is one thing you know how to do that you think nobody else in this room knows how to do? Silence. Then Nolan Varden said, what does that have to do with school? Nothing, she said. And everything. You first, since you're already talking. He looked at her, measuring. I can rope a steer in under 40 seconds, he said, one-handed. Good, she said. That's real knowledge. That takes practice and muscle memory and an understanding of physics, even if you'd never call it that. She looked at him steadily. Later this term we're going to talk about physics. And when we do, I'm going to remind you that you already understand it. You just haven't put words to it. Yet, she moved on before he could respond. Clara Hobbs pulled herself up straight and said, I can read faster than my mother. Few children laughed. Elowen smiled. Then you're going to help me, she said. She went around the room. One boy could identify 12 types of cloud formation. A girl named Bessie knew every edible plant within 5 miles of town, learned from her grandmother. A pair of brothers, 8 and 10, had built a working water wheel in the creek behind their house. Quiet girl in the back, who had not said a word since arriving, could do sums in her head faster than Elowen could do them on the board. As it turned out, minutes later when Elowen tested it, and the room went genuinely still when the girl, her name was Patience, and the name seemed both right and wrong for her, called out the answer to a 3-digit multiplication problem before Elowen had finished writing it. You're going to sit closer to the front, Elowen told her. Patience looked alarmed. I like the back. I know, Elowen said, but I need you where I can see you, because I suspect you're going to teach me things. Patience moved slowly, with the air of someone who had never been told their brain was useful and did not quite know what to do with the information. By the end of the first day, the room felt different than it had at the start. She could not have quantified it. Nobody had done anything remarkable. The reading lesson had gone fitfully, with 3 of the younger children clearly behind where they should be, and one of the older boys, not Nolan, a different boy named Clem, so far ahead that he was visibly bored and compensating by tipping his chair back at an angle that was going to end badly. The arithmetic had been uneven. The history lesson she'd attempted in the final hour had gone sideways when it turned out that 3 children had been told 3 entirely different versions of events I thought were settled, and she had spent 20 minutes navigating disagreement rather than teaching. But they were talking to each other, which they hadn't doing when they came in. That was something. Nolan Varden left without speaking to her, which was fine. He had stayed. He had answered her question. He had watched Patience do the arithmetic with an expression that moved through contempt and arrived somewhere in the vicinity of grudging interest. That was enough for the first day. She went home. She had started thinking of Ronan's place as home without noticing when it happened, which troubled her slightly when she noticed it, and she made supper and fed Toby, and sat at the kitchen table and wrote out what had worked and what hadn't, the margins of the flour sack lesson plan, and when Ronan came in from the field and looked at the annotations covering every available white space, he said, "How was it?" "Complicated," she said. "That's school," he said. "You have a teacher's manual in your trunk," she said. He went still for just a moment. "I know," he said. She waited. "My wife's," he said. "Margaret, she wanted to teach." He sat down and reached past her for the coffee pot. She didn't get to. She did not push further. She filed at Margaret, who had wanted to teach and hadn't gotten to, whose husband now slept in a barn, so a stranger could use his bedroom, and she thought about what that cost him, having the manual there, and she said, "May I keep borrowing it?" "That's why I showed you the trunk," he said. Neither of them said anything else about it. The trial month was the hardest sustained thing she had ever done, including the night in the storm, because the storm had been one terrible night, and then it was over, whereas this was hard in a different way, the long, grinding way, where every day required her to be competent at something she was still actively learning how to do. Mistakes. She moved too fast with the younger children and had to go back and teach things she thought she'd covered. She pushed Clem too hard on the reading, and he dug in and refused, and she had to find a different door into him, which turned out to be not reading at all, but having him read to the younger children, which made him feel useful instead of remedial, and which solved both their problems simultaneously. She misread Patience for 2 weeks, thinking her silence was shyness, and then realizing it was concentration, that the girl was always thinking about 4 things at once, and you had to wait for a gap. And then there was Nolan. He did not disrupt the class openly. He was too smart for that, and she understood early that his intelligence was real. He had his father's strategic mind, which was the most worrying thing about him, that he had clearly inherited the best tool his father owned and was using it in his father's service. He came late twice more in the first 2 weeks, both times with reasons that were plausible enough to argue over. He gave answers in class that were technically correct, but delivered in a tone designed to make the question seem beneath him. He had 2 allies in the classroom, boys his age named Pierce and Hector, and the 3 of them formed a block at the back of the room that operated on its own gravitational field, pulling attention and energy toward it. On the Wednesday of the 3rd week, she caught him helping Pierce with arithmetic. She didn't say anything about it. She just noticed it, and she thought about it. And the next day she reorganized the seating again so that Nolan was next to Patience. He looked at the arrangement and looked at her, and she could see the calculation running. Was this punishment? What was this? What did she want from it? And she said, before he could object, "Patience is the best mathematician in this room. You're the second best. I need you next to each other." She handed them both a problem she had worked out the night before, a real surveying problem from the almanac, the kind that required trigonometry she hadn't technically taught yet. "Work it out," she said. "Between you, I'll be back." She came back 20 minutes later to find them both, bent over the paper, arguing in low, intent voices about method. They had arrived at the answer by 2 different routes and were disagreeing about which route was more efficient. They were both right. She stood and listened for a moment before they noticed her, and she thought, there it is. That's what this room can be. "You're both right," she said. "Write up both methods. We'll put them on the board and let the class vote on which is cleaner." Nolan looked up at her. "Which one would you use?" he said. "Not challenging, actually. Patience's," she said. 3 steps instead of 5. "But yours has a check built into it that hers doesn't. So if you were doing real surveying work and you couldn't afford to be wrong, I'd do yours first and then check it with hers." She paused. "The answer to which method is better depends on what you can't afford to lose." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his face that she could not quite read. Then he looked back down at the paper. That was the first day she thought she might actually keep him. The end of trial meeting with the school board was on a Friday afternoon in the last week of October. She had asked 3 of the parents to attend Ruth Hobbs, because Ruth was a straight talker and the board knew it. A man named Garrett Cole, whose twin boys had gone from non-readers to sounding out three-syllable words, and a widow named Frances Pratt, whose daughter Bessie had written her first complete sentence in the third week of class and come home and read it to her mother at the supper table. She had not asked them to say anything specific. She had not coached them. She had just said, "If you are willing to tell the board what you've seen in your children this month, I'd appreciate it." Tate opened by talking about the arrangement above the store. He said the rent was $2.50 a month. She thought that was too high by at least 50 cents, but she said nothing about it. That was a different negotiation. Aldrich asked about her management of the classroom. She gave him numbers attendance, which had gone from irregular to consistent, reading improvement as she measured it, the arithmetic progress. Factual. She did not oversell. Then Ruth Hobbs said, "My daughter comes home and talks about school. First time in 3 years. She said it to Aldrich without looking at Tate. Not about what she did, about what she thought, what she figured out. She folded her hands on the table. That's not a small thing. Garrett Cole said his boys had had breakfast together that morning and spent 20 minutes arguing about which method was faster to add up a column of numbers. He said this with the expression of a man who had expected his sons to grow up ranching and was now not entirely sure and did not entirely mind. Frances Pratt said that Bessie had read to her from the reader for 15 minutes on Tuesday and that neither of them had cried, but it had been close. The board voted 3-1 to renew Elowyn's contract and offer full wages. Tate was the one. She thanked them and walked out, and Ruth was waiting on the sidewalk with Clara, who immediately attached herself to Toby with the single-minded focus of a child who likes babies better than most people, and Ruth said, "Well, full contract," Elowyn said. Ruth made that not-quite-law sound. "Good, because Varden's been running his mouth all month, and I was starting to worry we'd have to fight about it." "What has he been saying?" Elowyn said, and she heard the controlled quality of her own voice, the flatness she put on things that made her afraid. "That you lied to the board about your credentials," Ruth said, in the direct way of someone who had decided the kindest thing was to be straight about it. "That you're living at Ronan Hale's place for reasons other than what you've said. That a woman with a baby and no husband and no past she'll talk about has no business teaching other people's children." Elowyn stood on the sidewalk in October light, and she felt the familiar cold settle into her chest, the specific cold of being talked about in rooms she wasn't in, and she thought, this is going to happen. This has always been going to happen. She had known it since the moment Silas Varden rode into the yard and looked at her with those calculating eyes. "Is the board going to be moved by it?" she said. "Aldrich is fair," Ruth said. "He'll want evidence before he acts." Tate is already half convinced, because Tate thinks the worst of most people by nature. She looked at Elowyn. "What Varden is doing is building a case." Slowly. "He does it the same way, with Ronan puts pressure on from the sides first and sees what falls. He wants the ranch," Elowyn said. "He wants everything," Ruth said. "The ranch is part of it. You're just a convenient angle." She reached out and straightened Toby's hat, which Clara had knocked askew. "My advice, be visible. Be in this town. Be known by people as yourself, not as the story Varden is making out of you." She walked home, from the board meeting home, meaning the room above Tate's store, which she had moved into at the start of the month, and which was small enough that she could touch both walls if she stretched her arms out, but which was hers, and she sat on the edge of the bed with Toby asleep in the crate she'd lined with blankets, and she thought about what Ruth had said about being visible. She had spent her whole life learning to be small enough to fit into the spaces men left for her. Quiet enough, agreeable enough, present without being the kind of present that created discomfort. She had learned it so thoroughly. She hadn't even known she was doing it until the storm stripped everything else away and left her standing in a stranger's yard with 62 cents and a baby and nothing to be small for anymore. She was not going to be small in this town. She was going to be exactly what she was, which was a 24-year-old woman with an education and no money and a child and a stubbornness she was only beginning to understand the full extent of, and she was going to be it loudly enough that there was no room for Silas Varden's version to fit alongside the real one. It was a resolution that felt clean and right in the privacy of a small room at 9 in the evening. By the following Thursday, it was being tested. Nolan Varden came to school with something different about him. She noticed it when he walked in on time. He had been on time every day for 2 weeks, which she had not remarked on, and which he seemed to be daring her to remark on, and she noticed it in the set of his jaw, which was tighter than usual, and in the way he sat without looking at anyone. She let the morning lesson run. Arithmetic first, then the reading she'd assigned, then a discussion of geography that she'd been looking forward to because she had finally gotten Aldrich to loan her a proper map of the territory, and she had tacked it to the wall, and she could see the children orienting themselves to it with the fascinated intensity of people who have never seen their own world from above before. Even Nolan had looked at it. She had watched him find the approximate location of his father's land and trace the boundaries of it with his eyes, and she had seen something complicated move across his face. After the midday break, when the younger children were doing their reading and she had the older students working on a composition exercise, Nolan put his pencil down and he said, not loudly, to no one in particular, "My father says the school board made a mistake." The room got quiet, in the way rooms quiet when someone says a thing that was supposed to be the thing nobody said. Elwyn was at the front of the room. She finished writing the sentence she'd been putting on the board, set the chalk down carefully, and turned around. "Your father is entitled to his opinion," she said. "He says you lied about your credentials," Nolan said. He was not looking at her, which was the most interesting thing about it. He was looking at the composition exercise on the desk in front of him. "He says you told the board things that weren't true." "What specifically does he say I lied about?" she said. Now he looked up. He had expected her to get upset. She could tell he had expected the thing his father probably expected, which was that she would flush or stammer or capitulate. That being accused would make her lose her footing. He said, Nolan started, and then he stopped, because apparently when he looked at her and found her perfectly still and genuinely asking, the rehearsed words didn't fit the situation they'd been rehearsed for. "Nolan," she said, and she said it the way she said things when she wanted someone to understand she was being serious. "I want to answer the accusation, but to answer it I need to know what it is. What specifically am I supposed to have lied about?" Silence, longer than it should have been. "Didn't say specifically," Nolan said. "No," she said. "He wouldn't have, because there isn't anything specific. What your father knows about me is what he could see in a 5-minute conversation in a yard 6 weeks ago, which is that I'm a woman alone with a baby in a place he doesn't expect women like me to be." She looked at him, just at him, not at the rest of the class. "Your father is a smart man. He knows that if you say a thing often enough and specifically enough, people start looking for evidence of it instead of evidence against it. That's how a story becomes a fact without anything actually happening." She paused. "We talked about that last week. Do you remember what I called it?" Nolan's jaw moved slightly. "Assumption of guilt," he said. "Right." She picked up the chalk. "Finish your composition." She turned back to the board, and she listened to the room settle, and she heard Patience say, very quietly, to the girl beside her, she didn't even get mad. And she heard the response, equally quiet. She didn't have to. That night she sat at the small table in her room above the store, and she wrote a letter to the school board. Not a defensive letter, an informational one. She listed her education every year of it, every subject, every teacher she could name, and she stated plainly that she had represented all of it accurately to the board in October, and that she remained prepared to verify any of it by any reasonable means the board wished to employ. She signed it and folded it and addressed it to Aldrich, because Aldrich was fair, slipped it under the door of his office in the morning on her way to school. She did not mention Silas Varden by name. She did not need to. 2 weeks later, the letter Varden had sent to the board arrived on the same day that Elowyn's renewal contract arrived. She did not know the content of his letter. She was not shown it, which was appropriate, but she knew about it because Tate's expression when she paid rent that week had changed from its usual vague distaste to something edgier, the look of a man recalculating a position. She said, "Mr. Tate, is there something we need to discuss?" He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been hoping not to be asked that. "There are some concerns," he said, "about your situation, whether it's appropriate, a woman alone, teaching children." "The school board voted on that question in October," she said. "Some new information has come to the board's attention," he said. "From Silas Varden," she said. He didn't deny it. "From a concerned citizen." She thought about Ruth's advice, be visible, be yourself. She thought about the letter she'd written to Aldrich. She thought about Nolan's face when he'd had to admit his father hadn't said anything specific, just the shape of an accusation with no content inside it. Mr. Tate, she said, I have taught 23 days. In those 23 days, 11 children's reading ability has been measured and documented by me and can be verified by their parents. 7 of those children were functionally unable to read a full sentence in October. 6 of them can read a full paragraph now. She kept her voice even, not aggressive. Factual, the way she was factual with the board. My conduct has been witnessed by every parent who has come to that school, and most of them have come at least once because I invited them to. What exactly is the new information that outweighs that record? Tate said nothing. I'll be here next week, she said, and the week after, she paid her rent and left. The board did not call a hearing that week, or the next. But she felt it building the particular pressure of something happening in rooms she wasn't in, conversations being had about her, positions being staked out. Ruth brought her reports in the direct, matter-of-fact way of a friend who understood that you needed information more than comfort. Varden had spoken to 2 board members at a dinner at his house. He had raised questions about what kind of example an unmarried woman with a child set for the female students. He had apparently suggested that her presence at Ronan Hale's ranch, for those weeks before she'd taken the room above the store, was itself evidence of something. He's going for the hearing. On a Saturday morning in mid-November, when they were sitting in Ruth's kitchen, while Clara and Toby occupied themselves with a set of wooden blocks. He's going to push Tate to call for a formal review. He wants you to have to defend yourself publicly. Then I'll defend myself publicly, Elowen said. Ruth looked at her. You're not scared. I didn't say that, Elowen said. I said I'll do it. Ruth considered this. He's going to bring up Ronan, she said. He always does with Ronan. He knows how to make decent behavior look suspicious, if you frame it right. Elowen picked up her coffee. Ronan gave me a room when I had nowhere to go, she said. He slept in his barn because his wife's memory mattered more to him than his own comfort, and he didn't want a woman he didn't know to feel unsafe under his roof. She set the cup down. If Silas Varden wants to take that and make it into something ugly, he's going to have to do it in front of every parent whose child I've taught for the past 6 weeks, and he's going to have to explain to them what exactly is wrong with what I just described. Ruth was quiet for a moment. You need to talk to Ronan, she said. I know, Elowen said. She rode out to the ranch the next afternoon, Sunday Toby on her hip and a cold wind at her back. Ronan was in the yard when she came up the track, doing something to the hinges on the barn door, and he turned when he heard the horse, and he looked at her face and he said, What happened? Nothing yet, she said. But I think Varden is going to call a public hearing. And when he does, he's going to talk about you. She dismounted and stood in front of him. I wanted to warn you. You helped me, and now he's going to try to make that into something it wasn't. I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that steady reading look. Don't apologize to me for what Varden does, he said. I'm apologizing for bringing it to your door. You didn't bring it, he said. He's been at my door for 3 years. You just gave him a new angle. He turned back to the hinge he'd been working on. What do you need from me? She had thought about this on the ride out. What she needed was not for him to defend her. She could do that herself. What she needed was for the truth about those weeks to be available, stated clearly by someone who had been there. If there's a hearing, she said, I'd want you to come. Of course, he said, like it wasn't even a question. She held Toby against her chest and looked around the yard, the fence she'd repaired, still holding, the chicken pen properly latched, the woodpile higher than it had been when she arrived, because she'd helped stack it. Evidence of her actual time here, if anyone needed evidence. He's going to lose, Ronan said, still working on the hinge. You don't know that, she said. No, he agreed. But I know you. He got the hinge seated and tested the door. It's swung clean. I knew it that first morning when you told me you were going to find the rest of my chickens. You had 62 cents and a baby, and you were planning the next thing. He latched the barn door. People like Varden only win when the other person is too scared to stay in the room. You're not going to leave the room. She thought about the hearing, about standing in front of the whole town of Ash Creek and being examined like evidence, about Nolan Varden in the 3rd row of her classroom, sitting next to patients, the 2 of them bent over a surveying problem. No, she said, I'm not. She rode back to Ash Creek in the cold afternoon light, and the wind was at her face now instead of her back, and it was sharp enough to make her eyes water, and she rode into it with her chin level and Toby tucked inside her coat, and she thought about the hearing that was coming and about what she was going to say when she got there, and about the classroom that would be empty all winter if Varden won, and full if she didn't let him. She was not going to let him. The formal notice arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days before Christmas. School's windows were dark. The school board would convene a public hearing on the matter of Elowen Price's continued appointment as school teacher of Ash Creek, to be held the following Friday evening at the Grange Hall. All community members were invited to attend. The notice was signed by all 4 board members, including Aldrich, which meant Varden had gotten to enough of them to force the formal proceeding. She read the notice twice, standing in the doorway of the schoolroom before the children arrived, and she folded it and put it in her pocket and turned back to the board where she had written the day's arithmetic. And she thought, 10 days. I have 10 days and 23 children and everything I've done in this classroom. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Clara Hobbs appeared first, as she often did, being the type of child who preferred to arrive before the crowd so she could establish the lay of the land. She looked at Elowen and she said, "You look like my mother when something bad is happening, but she hasn't told us yet." "I'm fine, Clara," Elowen said. "My mother says that too," Clara said and sat down. Patience came in next, then the brothers, then Clem, then the others, one by one. And then last, with 2 minutes to spare, Nolan Varden. He sat down next to Patience, and he pulled out his composition book and he did not look at Elowen, and she wondered if he knew. She thought he probably did. Silas Varden did not strike her as a man who made moves without briefing his son. She wondered what Nolan made of the hearing, whether he had been told to be pleased about it. She started the lesson. She taught the same way she taught every day all the way through, no shortcuts, because the children deserved the same standard, regardless of what was happening in the Grange Hall Friday after next. Patience put 3 of the younger children through a multiplication drill with the focused efficiency of a 12-year-old who had decided to be useful. Clem read aloud from the reader in the clear, confident voice of a boy who had been afraid of reading 10 weeks ago. Clara Hobbs argued a point about geography with enough specific evidence that Elowen said, "Write that argument down, Clara. That's what a persuasive essay looks like." At the end of the day, when the room had emptied and she was erasing the board, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Not leaving footsteps. Arriving. She turned around. Nolan Varden was standing in the doorway. He stood there without coming in, and she waited, because she had learned that he needed a moment to get from the decision to the words, and if you rushed him, the words didn't come out the way he meant them. "My father is wrong," he said. She looked at him. "About you," he said. "About the school." He looked at the floor and then back at her, and she could see what it cost him, the specific cost of saying something you know your father would forbid. He does this. He decides what he wants, and then he makes the story that gets him there. I've watched him do it my whole life. He stopped. I thought it was smart. I used to think it was smart. "What changed?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You asked me what I thought," he said. "Not what my father thought. Not what was expected. What I thought." He looked at the map still tacked to the wall, the one she'd borrowed from Aldrich. "Nobody asks me that." She stood with the eraser in her hand, and she thought about what to say, and she decided on the truth. "Your father is going to try to end my time here," she said. "That hearing next Friday is his attempt. He may succeed." She said it without flinching because she thought he deserved honesty more than reassurance. "If he does, I want you to know that it won't change what you learned this term. That's yours. He can't take that." Nolan looked at her for a long moment. "He won't succeed," he said. And then, before she could respond, he turned and went down the stairs, and she heard his footsteps on the street below, quick and deliberate, and she stood in the empty classroom with the chalk dust settling in the low afternoon light, and she wondered what exactly he meant by that and what he was going to do about it, and whether she should be grateful or worried. She decided on both. She put the eraser down and she picked up her coat, and she gathered Toby from the blanket nest she'd made for him in the corner, and she walked down the stairs and out into the cold street of Ash Creek, and above the mountains to the west, the sky was doing the thing it did before snow, going a pale, flat, particular white, like paper held up to light, and she thought, 10 days. Whatever is going to happen in 10 days. She pulled Toby's hat down over his ears and walked home through the cold. Snow came the night before the hearing. Not a dusting. A real snow, the kind that settles in over the mountains in the afternoon and is still falling at midnight and has no particular intention of stopping. Elowen lay awake in the small room above Tate's store and listened to it and thought about what she was going to say the next evening and how she was going to say it. She had been doing this for 10 days, running the arguments, finding the holes, patching them, running them again, and she had arrived at something she felt was solid, or solid enough. But the snow made everything feel less certain, the way silence makes you second-guess what you were sure of in noise. Toby slept through it. He slept through most things now, which she took as evidence that the world had started to feel reliable to him in a way it hadn't in those first weeks. She lay on her side, watching him breathe in the thin dark, and she thought about the hearing, and she thought about Nolan's face in the classroom doorway, and what he'd meant by "he won't succeed," and she thought about Ronan's saying, "You're not going to." Leave the room, and eventually she stopped thinking and fell into the shallow, restless sleeps of someone who needs rest more than peace. She was up before dawn. She had learned that about herself in these months, that the mornings were when she was clearest, before the day accumulated its demands, when she could sit with coffee and think without defending herself from something. She made the coffee on the small stove in her room, the one Tate had provided with the air of a man bestowing a great favor, and she sat at the table with her notes spread in front of her, and Toby still asleep, and the snow still falling past the window in the gray first light. What she had was this: 10 weeks of a classroom she could document, children whose progress she had measured and recorded, parents who had seen it firsthand. What she had was Ruth Hobbs and Garrett Cole and Frances Pratt, who had already said they'd speak. What she had was a letter from Aldrich, acknowledging her credentials, written before Varden had started his campaign, which she had kept, because she kept everything now, had gotten careful about paper in the way that people get careful about things after losing everything once. What she did not have was certainty about the board. Tate was already against her. The minister's son, whose name was Owen Marsh, was the kind of young man who went whichever way the room went, which meant he would follow whoever spoke most convincingly, which was a variable she couldn't control. Burl the rancher said almost nothing, and she still could not read him. Aldrich was fair, but fairness was not the same as loyalty, and she was not sure he would hold against Varden if Varden came in with enough force. And Varden would come with force. She had stopped underestimating him weeks ago. She was still sitting with her notes when she heard boots on the stairs. Heavy, unhurried, the specific cadence she had been hearing for months now. She stood up before he knocked and opened the door, and Ronan was standing in the hall with snow on his coat and his hat and the general look of a man who had driven 12 miles in a December snowstorm before sunrise. She said, "You didn't have to come early. Roads will be worse by afternoon," he said. "I wanted to know how you're doing before the thing happens, not after." She stepped back to let him in. He took his hat off and set it by the door, and his coat, and she poured him coffee, and he sat at the table and looked at her notes, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand without being told what to think about them. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not sleeping," he said. "I'll sleep after tonight." He picked up his coffee and looked at her. "Varden's going to come at you about the ranch," he said. "I want you to know I'll answer it straight, whatever they ask." "I know you will," she said. "That's why I asked you to come." He was quiet for a moment, turning the mug in his hands. "Margaret kept a journal," he said. Elowen went still. This was its windows were dark. This was the most he had said about his wife in all the weeks she had known him, which meant he was saying it because it mattered tonight. She wrote in it every day, things she wanted to do, places she wanted to see. He looked at the coffee. She wrote about teaching, about what she thought it could be. Not just the letters and the numbers, but the making people see themselves as bigger than they thought. He stopped. "I read it after she was gone. Read it a lot, first year." He looked up. "What you've done with that classroom. It's close to what she wrote." Elsawan did not say anything for a moment, because there was nothing to say that would not be inadequate. "I'm glad," she finally said. And then, because honesty seemed like the only appropriate response to that kind of honesty, "I'm glad she existed. I'm glad you told me." He nodded once. He finished his coffee. He put the mug down and he said, "What time does it start?" 7 o'clock, she said. We'll get dinner first, he said. You need to eat. I'm not particularly hungry. I know, he said. You need to eat anyway, she almost argued. And then she looked at him sitting there in the small room in the morning light, having driven 12 miles in a snowstorm to be certain she'd eaten before the hardest evening of her year, and she thought about what it was to have someone in your corner who showed up for the practical things without being asked. And she said, all right. The Grange Hall was full by 6:30. That was the first thing she noticed when she and Ronan walked in. She had expected maybe 30 people, the core of the town, the ones with children in her class or strong opinions about the order of things. There were closer to 60. People she recognized and people she didn't, ranchers from outside town who had driven in through the snow, women she'd seen at the general store and not yet spoken to, a cluster of men near the back wall who had the look of Varden's hands. She felt the room look at her when she walked in, not all at once. It moved through the room like a current, the awareness of her arrival, and she felt it and she kept walking because stopping or hesitating was the one thing she could not do, and she found the seat Ruth had saved for her in the 4th row on the left side, and she sat down with Toby on her lap, and she did not look at Silas Varden, though she knew exactly where he was. Front row, right side, with the ease of a man who has already decided the outcome and is here mainly for the formality of it. Ronan sat beside her. The board arranged themselves at the table at the front. Aldrich in the center, Tate to his left, with that newly edged expression he'd been wearing since Varden's letter, Burl on the far right looking at the middle distance, Owen Marsh fidgeting with a pen. Aldrich called the room to order in the direct, carrying voice of a man who had run many such meetings and had a limited tolerance for them going long. He stated the purpose, a review of the appointment of Elowyn Price as schoolteacher of Ash Creek, requested by a member of the community, to be considered by the board in light of community testimony. He stated the rules. Speakers would be recognized and would have 5 minutes. The board would ask questions. A vote would follow. Silas Varden was recognized first. He stood with the easy authority of a man who has never had a room refuse him, and he turned slightly so he was addressing both the board and the audience behind him, which was the move of someone who understood that the real audience tonight was not the 4 men at the table. He was not, she had to admit, without skill. He had a rancher's plain manner that concealed a politician's instincts, and he had been preparing this the way she had been preparing her notes. He began with the credentials question. He said he had made inquiries and found no record of Elowyn Price at the Pennsylvania institution she had named to the board. He said this with the tone of a man delivering facts reluctantly, as though he wished it were otherwise. He paused and let it sit in the room. Elowyn felt the weight of the pause. She did not move. Second, Varden said, the matter of her conduct during the period prior to her appointment, when she was residing at a bachelor's residence under circumstances that, at minimum, deserves scrutiny from a community that employs this woman to educate its children. Someone in the room shifted. She heard it a collective adjustment, people settling into the discomfort of the thing being said plainly. 30 said, the question of stability. A woman who arrived in this community with no resources, no connections, no verifiable history, and who has been here less than 3 months, is not whatever her personal qualities, a foundation that a school can rely on. What happens when she leaves? What happens when the next difficulty presents itself, and she moves on as she moved in, without warning, without roots? He sat down. He had been exactly 5 minutes. Aldrich said, is there a response to the credentials question from Miss Price? She stood. She had thought about whether to stand or stay seated, and she had decided standing was right, because she was not going to defend herself from a position of supplication. The institution I named is the Hartwell Academy for Women in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, she said. It is a small institution and may not be widely known. I have here a letter from its director, which I wrote to obtain immediately upon taking this position because I anticipated the question. She held up the letter. The director confirms my attendance and my graduation. I am happy to have this letter examined by the board or by anyone in this room. She set it on the table in front of Aldrich. As for the credentials question in the broader sense, the board saw me teach. They asked me to demonstrate my ability to command a classroom. They voted on the basis of what they witnessed, not solely on paper. 10 weeks of classroom results speak to that decision more clearly than anything I could say tonight. She looked at Aldrich. He was reading the letter, she continued. Regarding my time at Ronan Hale's ranch. I arrived in this county in September with a sick infant, a broken wagon, and no resources. Mr. Hale found us in a storm and offered shelter. He gave me a room with a closed door and himself slept in his barn for the entirety of my stay, which can be confirmed by anyone who visited the property during that time. There was nothing irregular about the arrangement beyond the fact that a man chose decency over indifference, which I understand is not a common enough occurrence to go unremarked. She heard something that might have been a laugh from somewhere to her, left Ruth's direction. I was at his property for less than 2 weeks before I moved into the room above Mr. Tate's store where I have remained since. She paused. Mr. Varden has framed ordinary human kindness as something to be ashamed of. I decline to be ashamed of it. She sat. Aldrich set the letter down. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, Sister Hale, do you corroborate that account? Ronan stood. He was not a man who used more words than the situation required, and tonight he used fewer than usual. Everything she said is accurate, he said. Was in the barn. She was in the house. She fixed fence lines and found 6 of my 8 chickens that scattered in the coal storm, and she cooked meals I didn't ask for and couldn't have managed as well myself. There was nothing else. He sat. The room was very quiet. Most of its windows were dark. Then Ruth Hobbs stood without being recognized, which Aldrich acknowledged with a slight nod because he knew better than to try to stop Ruth once she was on her feet. My daughter couldn't read a full sentence in September, Ruth said. She read me a chapter of a book last Sunday. A chapter of a book. She looked directly at Silas Varden. I don't care where this woman is from or what kind of roof she slept under on her way here. I care that my daughter reads now. And that's what I came to say. Garrett Cole stood next. Said his boys had taken to arguing about arithmetic at breakfast, and did it with real knowledge, not just guessing. Frances Pratt stood and said Bessie had written a letter to her grandmother in Ohio, 4 paragraphs, with punctuation, and that her grandmother had written back saying it was the finest letter she'd received in years. A man Elowen didn't know well, a rancher named Sutter, who had never spoken to her directly, stood up and said his opinion was that whatever else was being discussed tonight, the school had a teacher for the first time in recent memory who actually intended to stay and do the job, and he thought the board should consider that before doing anything hasty. Varden spoke again. He was measured about it, careful, but she could hear something different in his voice now. A recalibration, the sound of a man, and finding the room has shifted under him and making the adjustment. He raised the stability question again, the matter of roots, of whether someone so newly arrived could truly be depended upon. He said it thoughtfully, as though it were a practical concern rather than an attack, which was the move of someone who understood he was losing the emotional ground and was retreating to procedural terrain. Good tactics. She had to give him that. Tate nodded along. Owen Marsh had stopped fidgeting with his pen and was looking at the audience with the expression of a man counting votes, which was, she supposed, what he was doing. Aldrich said, "Is there further testimony?" There was a moment of quiet. People had said what they'd come to say, and the room had the feeling of a thing that has run its course, the natural pause before the vote, and Elowen was already thinking about what the vote looked like. And whether she had enough Aldrich, she thought yes. Burl she didn't know, Tate no. Owen was the question when the sound of footsteps came from the back of the room. Not adult footsteps. Lighter. Quick. The specific rhythm of a young person walking with intention. Turned. Nolan Varden was walking up the center aisle. She heard the room notice, heard the change in the air, the collective intake, and she saw Silas Varden turn in his front row seat and see his son coming. And she watched his face go through 3 things in very fast succession: surprise, calculation, and then a controlled blankness that was its own kind of warning. Nolan stopped at the front. He did not look at his father. He looked at Aldrich. "I want to speak," he said. Aldrich studied him. "You're Silas Varden's boy." "Yes, sir," Nolan said. "This is a community hearing for adults." Tate started. "He's 15, Aldrich said, and his father has been heard. I think we can extend the same courtesy to his son." He nodded. "Go ahead." Nolan had his hat in his hands, and he was turning it, just slightly, which was the only visible sign of what it was costing him to stand there. He looked at the board, and then he looked out at the room at his father, for a moment, directly, and then away, and he said, "I've been in Miss Price's class since October. I went in thinking she wouldn't last, because none of them last, because my father said she wasn't what she claimed to be." He stopped. I was wrong. Both things. The room was very still. "She's the best teacher this school has had," he said. "I don't have anyone to compare to, except the ones I remember and what other people have said about teachers, but I know what it's like to sit in a classroom and feel like the time is passing and nothing is happening, and I know what it's like when something actually is. This is the second one." He shifted his weight. "She asked me what I thought on my first day. Not what I knew, not what I could recite, what I thought. Nobody in a classroom had asked me that before." He paused. "Patience Aldrich, your daughter, sir," he said to Aldrich, "is the best mathematician I have ever seen, and I didn't know that before October, because she was sitting in the back, and nobody was asking her anything either." There was a murmur. Aldrich's expression changed, specifically and visibly. "My father is right that Miss Price doesn't have deep roots here," Nolan said. "But roots come from staying, and she's trying to stay. And the reason she might not get to isn't because she's not the right person, it's because some people don't want her to." He stopped himself, and she could see him deciding how far to go, the specific decision-making of a 15-year-old who is not yet sure how much honesty the world will tolerate. "I don't think that's a good enough reason to lose a good teacher. That's all I wanted to say." He walked back to his seat. He did not look at his father. Silas Varden's face was a careful blank. She watched him hold it there, and she understood what it cost him, not the losing, not specifically, but the public nature of it, the fact that his instrument had turned in his hand in front of 60 people. Aldrich said, "Board will discuss." The discussion took 11 minutes. Counted. She sat with Toby and Ruth's hand on her arm, and she counted the minutes by the clock on the Grange wall, and she did not look at Silas Varden, and she did not look at the board, and she looked instead at the back wall of the room, where someone had hung a hand-drawn map of the county that she had never noticed before, and she traced the lines of it, and thought about the surveying problem she'd given Nolan and Patience, and the 2 different routes they'd taken to the same answer. The board came back. Aldrich said, "The vote is 3-1 in favor of retaining Miss Price in her position as school teacher with a contract through the end of the spring term and a salary increase of 15 cents per week in recognition of demonstrated performance." He looked at her. "Miss Price?" "Yes," she said. "The letter from Hartwell Academy will be filed with the board's records," he said. "This matter is closed." He hit the table once with the flat of his hand, which was how he ended meetings, and the room broke into the sound of people all deciding what to say to each other at once, that particular rising noise of a crowd that has witnessed something and needs to process it through conversation. Ruth said 15 cents more a week. He couldn't help himself. "It's something," Elowen said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "That's exactly right," Ruth said. "You earned it." She looked for Nolan. He was near the back of the room, standing apart from the crowd, the way he often stood apart from things, watching with his father's strategic eyes and his own unformed face. She made her way through the people toward him, and he saw her coming, and he stood still and waited. She said that was brave. He said it was just true. "Sometimes those are the same thing," she said. He looked at his hat in his hands. "My father's going to be—" He started, and then stopped. "I know," she said. "I'm not sorry," he said. "No," she agreed. "I didn't think you would be." She looked at him, this boy who was 15 and smart, and had his father's sharpest tool, and had chosen to use it differently tonight, and she thought about what Ruth had said about roots coming from staying, and she thought, this is a root. Right here. This boy standing here. This is a thing that happened in this town, and will keep happening because it happened. "Whatever comes next," she said, "what you know how to do with your mind, don't let anyone take that from you. Not your father, not anyone." He looked at her. She could see him storing it, the same way she stood things that mattered. Then he put his hat on, and he walked out, and a moment later she saw Silas Varden move through the crowd toward the door, and the 2 of them went out into the snow together, father and son, walking separately in the same direction with 10 feet of cold air between them. Ronan appeared at her elbow. "Ready," he said. "Not quite," she said. She turned back to the room to Ruth and Garrett and Francis and Sutter and the parents she had learned to know over the past 10 weeks, and the board members filing out, and Aldrich, who paused as he passed and said, "Good work, Miss Price," in the tone of a man who did not give compliments lightly, and knew it, and she thought, "This is what I have. Not land, not money, not the protection of a name or a husband or any of the things she had been raised to believe were the only kinds of protection that counted. She had this room full of people who had come out in December snow and said, "She stays." It was more than she had had in September. It was, she thought, more than most people ever had. She held Toby against her chest, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as it would take to walk to the door. And then she walked to the door. The snow had stopped. The street was quiet and white, and the night sky had cleared, the way it cleared after storms here suddenly, completely. The clouds gone, and the stars very close and sharp the way stars were at altitude. And the temperature had dropped with the clearing so that her breath came in visible puffs, and the snow underfoot had the dry, compressed sound of very cold snow. She stood in it for a moment. Ronan stood beside her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. They walked to where he'd tied the horses, and neither of them spoke much, which was their particular way. She thought about the spring contract and the salary increase, and about Monday, when she would go back into the classroom. And Nolan Varden would be in his seat next to Patience, and they would bend over whatever she had planned and argue about method. In those low, focused voices, and about Clara Hobbs, who read faster than her mother now, and about Patience, who had been sitting in the back where nobody was asking her anything. The winter passed the way Montana winters pass slowly, completely, with a kind of totalitarian thoroughness that she had not been prepared for, having only known Pennsylvania winters, which were cold but not serious in the same way. The snow came and stayed. The town of Ash Creek contracted into itself the way small places contract in hard weather, becoming simultaneously smaller and more intensely itself, every connection between people tightened by the fact of being snowed in together, taught through all of it. She was not, it turned out, a naturally gifted teacher in the sense of someone for whom the mechanics came easily. She planned too much for some lessons and not enough for others. She misjudged her students regularly in both directions, pushed when she should have waited. Most of its windows were dark, waited when she should have pushed, and spent the evenings rewriting the particular self-criticism of someone who has high standards and keeps falling short of them. She got better. Slowly, and not in a straight line, the way you get better at things that are genuinely hard. Nolan Varden came to school every day. She did not know what had happened between him and his father after the hearing. She did not ask. She could see evidence of it in the slight guardedness he wore for the first 2 weeks of January, the way he sat a little more carefully, like someone monitoring their own movements, but it did not last. By February, he was the same as he'd been before, the hearing sharp and difficult, and occasionally impossible, and genuinely, demonstrably brilliant, the kind of student who made teaching feel worth the cost of it. He started staying after school some afternoons. Not to talk, exactly. He would sit at his desk and work through problems she hadn't assigned, pulling books off the shelf and reading, with the focus of someone trying to cover ground as fast as possible. She let him. She answered questions when he asked them, and left him alone when he was reading, and eventually she started leaving extra material on his desk, things she thought he could use, books from the small collection Aldrich had helped her acquire, problems from the almanac that were at the edge of what she could teach him herself. One afternoon in February, he said, "What happens after here?" She looked up from the compositions she was marking. "What do you mean?" "After school here," he said. "What do I do with this?" He gestured at the books, the problems, the mathematics she'd been pushing into his hands all winter. "There's no college, not here." "There's college," she said. "Not here, but it exists." He looked at her with the skeptical expression of a 15-year-old who has learned that adults say things exist when they mean things exist for other people. "My father's not going to. What your father will or won't do is a problem for a year or two from now," she said. "Right now you're building what you'll need when you get there. That's what this is." She set down the composition she'd been reading. "Do you want to go?" He was quiet for a long time. "Yes," he said, like he hadn't said it out loud before and wasn't sure how it sounded. "Then we'll work toward it," she said. "That's what school is for." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as the one he wore when something was more than he'd expected, and he didn't know what to do with that. Then he bent back over his work. In March, a letter arrived from the East. She almost didn't open it. It came through Aldrich's office with the return address of a legal firm in St. Louis she didn't recognize, and she had learned to be careful about letters from people she didn't know, because the only strangers who had written to her in the past year had not generally brought good news. She opened it at the kitchen table in her room with Toby asleep and a cold rain on the window replacing the snow that had finally started to retreat. It was from a lawyer who represented the estate of a man killed in a robbery attempt in November. The man's name was Gideon Price. She read the letter twice. She read it with a strange absence of feeling that she recognized, after a moment, as not absence but density, too many feelings in too small a space, which produced a kind of blankness. Gideon was dead. She had told people he was dead since October, because he was functionally dead to her, because a man who rides away in the night with his wife's money and leaves his 6-month-old son in a storm to die is not a man who exists in any meaningful sense, but now he was actually dead, had been dead since November, killed while attempting to rob a store in Nebraska. The lawyer wrote that he had been in possession of a small amount of cash, a rifle, and a horse, all of which were legally Elowen's property if she could establish her claim. The lawyer's services would be required to recover them. She folded the letter. She sat with it folded in her hands for a long time. She was not sad. She noticed that she was not sad, and she spent some time looking at that, making sure she was reading herself right, and she was. What she felt was something more like the closing of a door that had been standing open all winter, letting cold air in, and she hadn't fully realized the cold was coming from it until it closed. She felt something settle. She felt the last of a weight she'd been carrying. So long she'd stopped knowing the weight of it, and it set itself down somewhere and stayed there. She was a widow now, formally, legally. She had been a widow in every real sense since September. She went to Ruth first, because Ruth was who she went to when she needed to think something through out loud with someone who wouldn't flinch or perform sympathy she didn't feel. Ruth read the letter and handed it back and said, "Do you want to deal with the lawyer?" "I don't know," Elowen said. "The horse and the rifle, those were mine. The money he spent, I imagine." She looked at the letter. "It seems like a lot of effort for a horse I don't actually need anymore." "Get the money you're owed from the estate, if there is any," Ruth said. "Leave the rest." She handed back the letter. "The lawyer will take half of whatever he recovers anyway." "I know," Elowen said. She folded the letter again. "I keep thinking I should feel more about him being dead." Ruth looked at her. "He left your baby in a storm," she said. "In September. He's been dead to you since then. The legal part catching up doesn't change what actually happened." "No," Elowen said, "I know." She wrote to the lawyer. She made the claim and gave him what information she had and told him to proceed or not, as the evidence warranted, and to contact her with any findings. Then she put the letter away in the tin box where she kept important papers, and she went back to school on Monday, and she fed Toby, and she taught, and she came home and she fed, and she sat at the table in the evening. She felt the door being closed. And it was not nothing, but it was not the thing she might have expected. And eventually she understood that this was what it felt like when grief had already done its work in advance, when you had already spent the worst of it standing in a storm with an empty box and a sick baby, and there was nothing left for the official news to break. The spring contract ran through May. In April, 3 things happened. The first was that Aldrich offered her a contract for the following school year at a wage that was meaningfully better than what she was earning, not generous, but fair. The kind of offer that said, "We want to keep you, and we've stopped pretending otherwise." She said she would think about it, because she was practicing not saying yes to things before she'd fully considered them. The second was that Patience Aldrich's father, who was, of course, Aldrich himself, came to Elowen after a school board meeting and said, somewhat stiffly, most of its windows were dark, that Patience had been talking about mathematics at dinner in a way that suggested she had more ability than he had understood, and that he wanted to know what Elowen thought Patience's prospects were. Elowen told him exactly what she thought, which was that Patience had a mathematical mind she had rarely, if ever, seen in a student of any age, and that the question was not what Patience was capable of, but what she would be allowed to do. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you." Miss Price, and walked away, and she thought he would do nothing with that information. But 2 weeks later, Patience came to school with a new reader, a serious one, for older students, and she said her father had ordered it from a catalog. It was a small thing, it was not things. The third was Ronan. He had been coming into town most Sundays since January, which was more often than he had before. Sometimes it was practical supplies, equipment, the necessary business of a working ranch. Sometimes it was less obviously practical, and she did not remark on this because she was not sure yet what she thought about it, and she had learned not to speak about things before she knew what she thought. On an April evening when the snow had finally receded enough that you could see dirt again in the yard behind the store, and the air had that specific edge of almost spring that was colder than it looked but bright with it, they had supper at Ruth's house. Ruth had made a habit of Sunday suppers that included whoever was in town. And afterward, Ronan walked with her back to the store, which he had done before, and they were standing in the street outside, and he said, "I'd like to ask you something." She waited. "Not about anything that needs an answer right now," he said. "Just I want you to know I'm asking it." He was looking up the street, and then he looked at her, and she could see it cost him something. Not out of weakness, but out of the particular difficulty of a man who has learned to protect everything inside himself and is choosing not to. "I'm not asking you to give anything up," he said. "Not the school, not this town, not any of it. I'm just saying I'd like for there to be more. With you, when you're ready for that, if you ever are." She looked at him standing in the April street, in the cold late light, this man who had ridden out of a storm and given her his bedroom and slept in a barn and showed her the tools and driven 12 miles in December snow and sat beside her in the Grange Hall without making it mean anything she hadn't asked it to mean. Most of its windows were dark, and she thought about what she had been and what she was now, and the difference between them, and she thought about what it meant to choose something rather than need it. She said, "I'm not ready right now." He nodded. "I know, but I want you to know that I heard it," she said, "what you said. And she stopped, finding the right word, which was not grateful, not relieved, not any of the words she would have used before September. "I'm glad you said it." He put his hat back on. "All right," he said. "I mean that," she said. "I know you do," he said. And then, in the particular way he had of moving on from things he'd said what he meant about, "I'll see you next Sunday." She watched him walk back down the street toward where his horse was tied, and she stood in the cold April evening with the sound of Ash Creek settling into itself for the night all around her, and she thought about the spring contract, and about Patience and her new reader, and about Nolan staying after school to work through problems at the edge of what she could teach him, and about Ronan's voice saying, "I'd like for there to be more," and about the empty box and the 62 cents, and she thought, "Look where you are. Look at what you built." She went upstairs. Toby was awake, pulling himself up on the edge of the crate, which he had only started doing in the last 2 weeks, standing, unsteadily, holding on, looking around at the world from the unfamiliar height with an expression of absolute, astonished concentration. He saw her, and he made the sound he made when he saw her, the specific sound that meant her, and nothing else in the world. And she crossed the room, and she crouched down to his level, and she looked at him looking at her, and she thought, "This is enough, right now. This specific moment. This is enough and more than enough. And whatever comes next," this happened. She picked him up. He grabbed her collar in his fist and leaned his head against her neck. And she held the mountains were still holding in the spring evening, and outside the mountains were still holding their snow at the peaks, but everything below was turning green, slowly, the grudging patient green of high country coming back to life after a long winter, and she thought about what Ronan had built over the years alone, fence line by fence line, season by season, and she thought about what she had built in 8 months, desk by desk, lesson by lesson, day by day. She thought, "I am not done yet, not by a long way." She stood at the window with Toby and looked out at the street below and at the mountains beyond it, and she let herself have the moment completely without reaching forward to the next thing or backward to the worst thing, just this, standing, upright, in a place she had built for herself, holding her son. The second year started differently than the first, not dramatically differently. The classroom was the same room, same low ceiling, same scratched slate boards, same smell of pine and chalk that she had come to associate with the particular satisfaction of a place that was hers. But the children came in on the first Monday of September without the careful wariness of the year before, without that held-breath quality of people who weren't sure yet what kind of room they were walking into. They came in talking to each other, arguing about seats, Clara Hobbs arriving early as always to establish the lay of the land, and finding that the lay of the land was exactly where she'd left it, in May, which seemed to please her enormously. Eowyn stood at the front and watched them settle, and she thought, this is what continuity feels like. She had not had much of it in her life, and she had not known how much it weighed until she felt the absence of the weight. There were 16 students this year. 2 new ones, a girl of 9 named Ada, whose house family had come in from Wyoming over the summer, and a boy of 7 named Samuel, who was Ruth Hobbs's nephew, deposited with Ruth for the school year because his mother was ill and his father was working a mine claim. Samuel had his aunt's directness and none of her social judgment, which meant he said whatever he was thinking at the precise moment he was thinking it, which was occasionally inconvenient and frequently clarifying. Nolan Varden was back. She had not been entirely certain he would be. She knew from Ruth, who knew most things that happened in a 10-mile radius, that the winter and spring had been difficult at the Varden house, that Silas had not spoken to his son for 3 weeks after the Grange Hall hearing, that the silence had eventually broken in the way silences between fathers and sons always broke imperfectly, incompletely, with things left unsaid that would stay unsaid, and that Nolan had spent the summer working the ranch with the kind of focused, wordless industry of a young man who is doing penance for something he does not regret. He came in on the first day at exactly the right time, not early, not late, and he sat down next to Patience, who had saved the seat without apparently being asked. And he put his books on the desk, and he looked at Eowyn and he said, "What are we doing this year?" "More," she said. He almost smiled. "More what?" "Everything," she said. "The same things, but further in." He nodded, apparently satisfied with this, and opened his composition book to a clean page. She had spent the summer preparing for the second year with the focused energy of someone who understands that the first year proved she could do the job, and the second year had to prove she could do it well. She had written to the Hartwell Academy, her old school, and asked her former mathematics instructor for book recommendations. She had borrowed an advanced reader from Aldrich's personal library and copied out passages by hand. She had reorganized her lessons progressions, fixing the things that had gone wrong in the first year, trying to anticipate the new things that would go wrong. She had also, over the summer, gone back to Ronan's ranch. Not because he had asked her to, though she thought he would have, if she'd given him an opening. She had gone because the room above Tate's store had no work in it over the summer months school was out. She had some wages saved, but not enough to be comfortable. And the ranch had more work than one man could manage well through the canning and preserving season. She had made the offer the same way she made most offers, directly and without dressing it up, room and board in exchange for labor, the same terms as the previous autumn, no other implications attached. Ronan had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Those terms are fine." So she had gone back. She and Toby, who was walking now with the determined, slightly lurch and recover gait of a just-turned 1-year-old, and who had developed a complete and passionate obsession with the ranch's remaining 6 chickens, following them around the yard with a focused intensity that the chickens seemed to find deeply unsettling. The summers had been different from the autumn. The crisis quality was gone. She was not arriving desperate, not discovering her limits in real time, not performing a version of fine that she didn't quite feel. She was just there, doing the work. And it turned out that doing the work with someone you trusted, without having to think about whether to trust them, was a profoundly different experience from any other kind of working she had done. They mended the north fence together, which went faster than when she had done it alone, and better than when he had done it alone, because she had learned in the past year what she was doing with wire, and he had a habit of not checking his angles that she got caught twice and pointed out without fanfare, and he corrected without defensiveness, which was the kind of small, functional exchange that she had learned to value highly because it required both people to be secure enough to give and receive it. They preserved food vegetables from the kitchen garden, berries from the ridge, salt pork that Ronan had traded for. She had learned to can properly by then, from Ruth and from Frances Pratt's older sister, who had the best organized root cellar Eowyn had ever seen, and its windows were dark, and she did not have to learn the work while doing it the way she had learned everything that first autumn. She could just do it. In the evenings, they sat at the kitchen table. Ronan with his accounts and his planning books for the ranch. Elowen with her lesson preparations, and, when those were done, with a novel she had ordered from a catalog, something she had not allowed herself to do before, the pure luxury of reading something with no purpose beyond the reading of it, which felt almost illicit and also deeply necessary. They talked more than they had the first time, not dramatically more. Ronan was still fundamentally a man who said things when he had things to say, but she had learned the spaces in his silence, the difference between the silence that meant he was content and the silence that meant something was sitting uneasily, and she had found that if she asked a direct question, he answered it directly, which was its own kind of conversation, even if it was a different shape from what other people meant by the word. She asked him once, in the middle of July, what he would do if Varden found a way to take the land. It was not a comfortable question, but she asked it because she wanted to know what he thought, not what a person was supposed to think about such a question. He was quiet for longer than usual. "I don't know," he said finally. "I've been here 11 years. I built most of what's here." He turned a page in his account book without reading it. "But it's land. I could find more land." He looked at her. "What I couldn't replace is harder to identify." She understood what he meant. She let it sit. On a Tuesday evening in the third week of August, Toby fell asleep early. The summer outside hours had been wearing him out in the most useful possible way, and Elowen came out to the porch where Ronan was sitting with the last of the light going off the mountains, and she sat down on the step beside him, not in the chair he'd indicated, just on the step, and she looked at the same mountains he was looking at, and she said, "I've been thinking about what you said in April." He did not say anything, which was the right response. I think she stopped. She had the words ready. She had arranged them in her head several times over the summer, but saying them out loud in the actual moment was different from the rehearsal, and she needed a second to find the right starting place. "I spent a long time being afraid that needing someone was the same as being trapped by them, because the evidence I had supported that." She looked at the mountains, Gideon, the wagon train, everyone who made a decision about my life without being asked, and then left me to live inside the decision. She paused. "But you didn't do that. You haven't done that. Not once." Ronan's was still quiet. He was watching her in the way he watched things as trying to understand fully before he spoke, and she had learned to value that about him, even when it made her feel exposed. "I'm not in a hurry," he said. "I know," she said. "That's partly why I'm saying it now." She turned to look at him directly, which was the position she was in when she said hard things straight on. No angle. "I'm saying I want to get there, whatever there is. I'm not saying when." She paused. "I'm saying the direction." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. She had expected she wasn't sure what she'd expected. More words maybe, or some visible sign of relief. What she got was what she should have known to expect. Him, exactly himself, receiving the information she'd given him and fitting it into everything he knew about the situation, with the same quiet attention he gave everything. "Is that enough?" she said, and she heard the slight edge of uncertainty in her own voice, which was honest, and she was not going to hide it. "More than enough," he said. They sat on the porch until the light was completely gone from the mountains, and the stars came out over the ridge, and the night sounds of the ranch came up around them. The horses in the barn, the chickens settled, the wind in the grass, and neither of them said anything else about it. And it was exactly right that they didn't. She went back to town for the school year, and the second year began. October arrived, and with it, unexpectedly, a letter that changed the temperature of things with Silas Varden. It did not come to her. It came to Ronan, forwarded through the county land office, and Ronan brought it to town on a Sunday and handed it to her at Ruth's supper table without comment. She read it twice. It was a legal notification. Varden had filed a challenge to Ronan's deed on the basis of a surveying error he claimed had been made during the original land grant, which placed the western boundary of Ronan's property differently from what Ronan's deed stated. The child challenge was filed with the county court and would require a hearing before a land commissioner in the spring. Ruth said, "He's been planning that for a while." "Survey error," Ronan said. "There's no survey error. I've got the original documentation." "Do you have a lawyer?" Elowen said. "No. You need one." He looked at her. "Lawyers cost money I'd rather spend on fence wire." Losing the land costs more, she said. Ruth said Henderson in Butte. He's handled land cases in this county before. Solid man. Ronan was quiet for a moment, which was his version of reluctance, doing battle with common sense. Common sense was winning. She could tell by the set of his jaw. All right, he said. This is about me, Elowen said. It was not a question. He looked at her. The timing, she said. He lost the hearing last December. He lost the school board. He's coming at the land now because it's the last angle. She said it flat. The way she said things she needed to say without extra weight on them. He's using the land because he can't use me anymore. Ronan picked up his coffee. He was always going to try for the land, he said. You accelerated it. That's not the same as causing it. She understood the distinction. It did not make her feel better, but she understood it. What do you need from me? She said. Nothing, he said. This isn't yours to carry. That's not what I asked, she said. He looked at her steadily. Let me handle this one, he said. I'll hire Henderson. The documentation is solid. Varden can challenge all he wants. The record says what it says. He set the coffee down. You have enough to manage. She thought about arguing and decided against it. He was right that the documentation was solid. She had seen it. He had shown her the original deed and the surveying records the previous summer out of a general habit of transparency that she had come to understand was not common in men and was one of the things she valued most in him. He was right that she had enough to manage. And there was a third thing she didn't say, which was that she recognized this was the one thing he needed to handle himself. The land that had been his for 11 years, the thing he had built before she arrived and would hold after she arrived, and that asking to be part of it before she was part of his life in the formal sense would be overstepping in a direction she had chosen, not to step. She said, write to Henderson this week, Monday, he said. This week, she said. Ruth made a sound that was entirely a laugh this time. Ronan looked at Ruth, and then back at Elowen with the expression he wore when he had decided that whatever was being asked of him was reasonable, even if the manner of asking was direct to the point of abruptness, and he said, this week. Nolan Varden came to school the Monday after the letter arrived, and he did not know about it, or if he did, he gave no sign. She was careful not to give any sign either. Whatever was happening to come in their fathers, between her life, was not going to come into the classroom while she had anything to say about it. She had made that decision in September, and she held to it. What she had not anticipated was that Nolan would bring it in himself, in the way that things in small towns always move through the children, because children hear everything and store it without context. He stayed after school on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October. The other children had gone, and she was marking compositions, and Toby was in the corner, stacking and unstacking a collection of blocks that Ruth's Clara had outgrown and donated with the regal generosity of an 8-year-old who has moved beyond such things. Nolan sat at his desk for a while, not quite reading the book he had opened, and then he said, my father's going to lose. She looked up. The land case, he said. He's wrong about the survey. I've seen the original maps. I've seen both sets of maps, ours and Hale's, and he's wrong. He looked at the book he wasn't reading. He knows he's wrong. He's doing it anyway because he thinks Hale won't have the money to fight it all the way through, and a drawn-out case costs more than it's worth even when you win. He paused. I'm not asking you to do anything. He stopped. I wanted you to know that I know. She set down the composition she'd been reading. Nolan, she said, what your father does with his land claims is not your responsibility to manage. You understand that. I understand it, he said, but I still know about it. Yes, she said, that's different. He was quiet. There's a difference, she said, between knowing something is wrong and being responsible for it. You didn't file the claim. You can't unfiled it. What you can do, she paused, finding the right version of this, is know the difference between what your father thinks is smart and what actually is, and then use your own mind accordingly. He looked at her with that particular expression she had come to associate with him, processing something he hadn't fully considered from that angle. I want to leave, he said, then correcting himself, not I don't mean now. I mean, eventually he looked at the window. There's a teacher's college in Missoula. Henderson's son went there, I found out last spring. And there are engineering schools in the East. He said it the way he'd said he wanted to go last winter, like he was testing whether it would survive being said out loud. I want to do something with, he gestured at the books, the same gesture as before. With your mind, she said. Yes. How long have you been thinking about this? Since last spring, he said. Maybe longer. He picked up his pen and put it down. My father wants me to stay, take over the ranch eventually. He hasn't said it directly, but that's what it is. She thought about what to say, and she decided on what was true rather than what was comfortable. Your father's plans for you and your plans for yourself are going to have to meet somewhere, she said. I won't pretend that's simple. It's not. She looked at him. But the time you spend learning now is not wasted, regardless of what you decide or where you end up. Part is just yours. Full stop. He nodded slowly. I'm going to write some letters, she said, to some schools, on your behalf with your academic record. Not making any decisions, just finding out what's possible. She held up a hand before he could object. You don't have to do anything with the information. I just want you to have it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and went back to his work, and she went back to the compositions, and Toby knocked his block tower over and started over from the beginning with the philosophical equanimity of someone who has not yet learned that collapsing things are supposed to be upsetting. The land case went to the commissioner in March, as scheduled. Henderson from Butte was thorough in the way that mattered, not showy, not theatrical, but systematic, with an ordered presentation of documentation that made Varden's challenge look like what it was, which was a procedural harassment built on a misreading of records that he had chosen to misread. The commissioner was a woman named Alderton, which surprised every woman named Alderton, which surprised everyone present, including Elowin, who had not known that women served as land commissioners, and who revised her understanding of what was possible in this territory accordingly. Alderton was somewhere in her 50s, gray-haired and unimpressed by everyone in the room, and she heard both sides and asked precise questions and reserved her decision. 3 weeks later, the decision came down in Ronan's favor. The deed stood as written. Varden's challenge was dismissed. Court costs were assigned to the challenging party, which was Varden, which was a detail Henderson had pushed for and Alderton had granted, and which meant that Varden's legal adventure had cost him money in both the spending and the losing. Ronan told her on a Sunday. He drove into town, and he came to the door of the store and knocked, which he did not always do. Sometimes he just appeared at the supper table at Ruth's, having timed his arrival with the economy of a man who understood that planning could be confused with sentiment, and she opened the door, and he was standing there with his hat in his hands, and he said, "The decision came." She said, "I know. Word got here Friday." He looked at her. "You didn't say anything." "I was waiting for you to tell me," she said. "It was yours to tell." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I come in?" She stepped back, and he came into the room, and he sat down at the table, and he looked at his hat, and then at her, and he said, "I want to ask you something." She sat down. "I've been thinking about how to say this correctly for about 4 months," he said, "and I've decided that I can't say it correctly. I can only say it, so I'm going to say it." He set the hat on the table. He looked at her. "I would like to marry you, not because of the land or the school or any of the practical things, because of you." He paused. "I know you've needed time to get there. I've tried to give you that. I think we're there or close to it, but I don't know what you're thinking, and I'd rather ask and be wrong than not ask, and have that be the thing I was wrong about." She looked at him across the table. She had been, in fact, thinking about this since August. She had thought about it in the measured, honest way she tried to think about things that mattered, not imagining outcomes, not planning weddings, just asking herself the plain question and sitting with the answer until it settled. What she had arrived at was what she had told him on the porch, the direction. She had known the direction for months. What she had needed was to be sure that knowing the direction came from inside her rather than from outside pressure or loneliness, or the ordinary human tendency to lean toward warmth. She was sure. "Yes," she said. He was still for a moment. "Yes," she said again, because she wanted it to be clear. "I mean it. Yes." He let out a breath that she realized had been held since he walked in. It was such an involuntary and human thing, that released breath, so different from the controlled, measured way he presented himself to the world, that she felt something in her chest turn over with a particular tenderness. "All right," he said. "You're going to stop there," she said. "I thought that was sufficient," he said. "It is," she said, and she laughed, which was one of the things she had discovered about herself in the past 18 months, that she laughed more than she had in the 14 months of her marriage. and that this was both a simple thing and not a simple thing at all. They were married in May, not elaborately. Ruth organized what there was to organize, which was a gathering at the Grange Hall, the same Grange Hall where Elowen had defended herself the previous December, which she thought was appropriate, as though the room that had tried to be used against Herder had been reclaimed for something better. Aldrich was there, and the minister's son Owen, who had grown considerably more backbone over the course of the school year, and who shook Ronan's hand with something approaching genuine warmth. Garrett Cole and his twins, Frances Pratt and Bessie, who was now reading at a level that Frances had stopped trying to quantify and had started simply appreciating. Patience Aldrich, who came with her father, and who stood next to Nolan Varden for most of the evening, both of them on the edge of the crowd with their particular quality of people who are more comfortable observing than participating, though for entirely different reasons. Silas Varden was not there. Nolan was. He had come on his own, without being specifically invited in a formal sense, though she had mentioned it to him the week before, in the way that she mentioned things to him factually, without additional pressure. He had arrived in his good coat, looking slightly uncomfortable in the way of a 16-year-old in a good coat at an adult gathering, and he had shaken Ronan's hand with a formality that made Ronan look at him with a complicated expression she couldn't entirely read, and he had said to Elowen, "Congratulations, Miss Price." "Mrs. Hale," she said, or still Miss Price in the classroom. "I haven't decided." He thought about that. "Miss Price in the classroom makes sense," he said. "It's a different place." "It is," she said. Ruth had managed to produce an actual cake which remained a mystery to everyone present as to how she had accomplished it, and Clara Hobbs ate more of it than any adult considered prudent, and experienced the consequences of this judgment privately and without complaint, which was the most Ruth thing imaginable. Toby, 18 months old now, and thoroughly verbal in the specific way of toddlers who've been in a schoolroom since before they could walk, spent most of the evening following Patience Aldrich around saying her name Pace, 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 with the single-minded persistence of someone who has decided this person is interesting and intends to confirm it. Patience bore this with the resigned patience her name suggested, and occasionally held his hand when he required ballast. Elowen stood at the edge of the room at one point, late in the evening, with a cup of something warm that Ruth had pressed on her, and she looked at the people there, the town she had not planned to live in, the life she had not planned to have, and she thought about the night in the storm with a specificity that still surprised her sometimes, how fully she could still access it. The broken wheel, the empty box, the 31 wagons disappearing into the rain, the temperature dropping, and Toby's hands going cool, and the 4 hours of firewood, and the arithmetic she had done in the back of the ruined wagon that had come out the same wrong way every time she ran it. She had been certain she was going to die that night. Not dramatically certain, just matter-of-factly, in the way you are certain about mathematics, because the numbers had said so. The numbers had been wrong. Or rather, the numbers had not accounted for a man who had made a decision years earlier, after losing someone he loved, that he would not ride past people who needed help. That was the variable that had broken the equation. Not luck, not the intervention of any force larger than a human being making a choice. Just Ronan, deciding to be the kind of man his grief had taught him to be. She thought about Gideon, which she did sometimes and with decreasing frequency. She did not hate him anymore. She had hated him through most of the winter, a clean and useful hatred that had kept her moving on, days when moving felt impossible, and then the spring had come, and the hatred had done its work, and she had set it down somewhere along the road and left it there. What she felt now when she thought of him was something closer to recognition. A recognition of how thoroughly she had not known him, how much of the 14 months of their marriage had been performed rather than real, two people acting out roles neither of them had quite fit. She was sorry it had gone the way it went, not for his sake specifically, but for the waste of it. For Toby growing up without a father, which was a loss, even when the father in question was not the kind of man Toby needed. She was standing there with these thoughts when Ronan found her. He stood next to her, the way he stood next to her clothes but not crowding, present without demanding the presence be acknowledged. And he followed her gaze across the room to where Toby had given up on patience and was now trying to befriend Samuel Hobbs, Ruth's nephew, with the slightly too aggressive friendliness of an 18-month-old. You're thinking, he said. I'm always thinking, she said. You're thinking about the past, he said. He could tell, apparently. She filed that away, the fact that he could read her well enough to know the quality of her thinking, which was not a thing she had expected to have in her life, and which she was still learning not to find alarming. Just about how different it is, she said, from what I thought it was going to be. He was quiet for a moment. Better or worse? Neither, she said. Just different. She looked at Toby, who had successfully engaged Samuel and was now demonstrating something with great conviction and no discernible coherence. I thought by now I'd know more. About what I was doing. About whether I was doing it right. She paused. I thought you reached a certain point and it settled. Everything settled. Does it? He said. No, she said. Doesn't seem to. No, he agreed. It doesn't. She thought that was actually the most useful thing anyone had said to her about life in quite some time. Not that it got better or easier or more certain, but that it didn't settle, that the unsettledness was not a sign of failure, but of being alive in it, still working, still adjusting, still in the middle of the thing, rather than at the end of it. She took his hand. Not dramatically, just took it. The way you take something that belongs to you, that you have put down for a moment and are picking back up. He closed his hand around hers, and they stood like that at the edge of their wedding party in the Grange Hall in May, watching Toby and the chickens of their social world doing whatever it was they were doing, and it was not a perfect moment. It was not its windows were dark. It was not even a particularly tidy moment. It was just theirs, and that was sufficient, and she had learned that sufficient was more than she had once been grateful for. Summer came. She moved to the ranch, fully this time, with her books and her teaching materials, crate-turned bed, and the tin box of important papers, and the copy of the teacher's manual that had been Margaret's. She put the manual on the shelf in the kitchen, which felt right to her in a way that was hard to explain. She would not have wanted it in the bedroom, which was private and not in the barn. Kitchen was where she had been the kitchen was she had first made fire in this house, the first thing she had made here, and putting Margaret's manual on the kitchen shelf felt like a way of including her in something she had wanted. Ronan did not comment on this. She thought he noticed, and she thought it cost him something, and she thought the cost was worth paying because Margaret deserved to be in the house she had been part of, and because Ronan deserved to be in a house where her name was not a thing to be carefully avoided. She asked him once directly if it was all right. He said, she would have liked you. She said, tell me what she was like. And he did. Not all at once, not in a single conversation, but over the course of that summer in pieces. The way you tell a person about someone who mattered a detail here, a story there, the way Margaret had laughed, the way she had been terrible at cooking, but had refused to acknowledge it. Most of its windows were dark, the way she had kept lists of everything she wanted to learn, and the lists had gotten longer every year rather than shorter, because learning things showed her more things she didn't know yet. Elowen listened and did not say anything that would close the telling, and over the summer, the shape of Margaret assembled itself in the house in a way that was not haunting, but something more like presence. The way people you have loved are present even in their absence, if you let them be. In August, a letter came from Nolan. He was writing, he said, to tell her that he had received an acceptance from a school in Missoula, a preparatory program, a step toward the engineering school he had identified in the East. His father had not spoken to him since he told him. He was leaving in September. He wanted her to know because she was the one who had written the letters, and also because she was the one who had first asked him what he thought, and he thought she should know what the consequences of that question had turned out to be. He said, I understand now what you meant about roots coming from staying. I am going to leave, and I know I am not staying, but I am not leaving the way I thought I might leave a year ago, which was to escape. I am leaving to come back eventually with more than I have now. That feels different. I think you would say it is different. She wrote back that same evening. She told him he was right that it was different. She told him that the mathematics he had learned were genuinely his, taken with him, not left behind. She told him that she was proud of him in the particular way that you are proud of someone who has done something genuinely difficult that they did not have to do, and that she thought she was correct in her assessment, that he had more courage than he knew. Though she noted that knowing you have courage and having it were not the same thing, and he was going to have to keep discovering it situationally, which was how most people experienced it. She told him, "Write when you want to. You don't have to." He wrote. Not frequently, but he wrote. 1 year after the storm, Ronan drove out to the place where she had been found. He had told her he was going to do something and had not said what, and she had not pressed him this too. She had learned the art of not pressing, and he had been gone most of the day and had come back in the late afternoon with the wagon bed, carrying something large wrapped in canvas. She was in the kitchen when she heard him pull up. She came to the door. He was unwrapping something in the yard. Canvas came off, and she saw what it was: the wheel. The broken wheel from the wagon. He had retrieved it from wherever it had sat for a year in the mud and weather of that valley, and he had brought it back. She stood in the doorway. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. It was in worse shape than the night she'd last seen it, which she wouldn't have thought possible. A year of Montana weather had done what the storm had started. The rim was split in 2 places and gray with weathering. Spokes that had survived the break were warped. It looked like what it was something that had failed catastrophically and then been left to the elements. Ronan stood it upright in the yard, leaning it against the fence post she had repaired that first autumn. He looked at her. "I want to put it on the gate," he said. "Mounted, if you're all right with that." She walked out into the yard. She stood in front of it and looked at it. Looked at it the way she had not looked at it on the night itself, because she had been too busy surviving the night. It was just a wheel. It was a completely ordinary wagon wheel that had broken in a storm. There was nothing remarkable about it except what had come after. She thought about what Ronan was doing, putting it on the gate. She thought about what it would mean driving past it every day, seeing it. She thought about whether that was something she could do, whether it was something she wanted to do. Most of its windows were dark, whether keeping the broken thing in view was a way of honoring the survival or a way of staying in the night that had been the worst night of her life. She thought about it for a long time, standing in the yard with the afternoon light going gold over the mountains. "Yes," she said, "put it on the gate." He mounted it himself, with the careful attention he gave to work that mattered, and she held the post while he fixed the bracket, and Toby supervised from the ground by sitting in the dirt next to the post and watching with great concentration, occasionally offering commentary that neither of them could fully decode. When it was done, they stood back and looked at it. It was not a beautiful object. It had not become beautiful by surviving. It was still a broken wheel, gray and warped and imperfect, and it hung on the gate of the ranch with a particular quality of something that had been through more than it was designed for, and had not been designed well to begin with. She looked at it for a long time. "It's not a triumph," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's a fact." She thought about that. A fact. Not a symbol. Not an inspiration. Not a story about resilience or perseverance, or any of the clean words people use for things that were, in reality, terrifying and messy and barely survived. Just a fact. This happened. Here is the evidence that it happened. It broke, and you did not break with it, and here you both are. She could live with that. That winter, she found out she was pregnant. She told Ronan on a Tuesday morning in November, not because she had planned Tuesday morning, but because she woke up that morning with the knowledge solidly in her, and she did not want to carry it alone even for a day. He was at the table with his coffee and his account book, and she sat down and she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her. She told him. He was still for a moment, the way he was still when something was more than he had expected and he was making room for it. Then he reached across the table and he put his hand over hers, and he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, "I think so. Are you?" He looked at her hand under his. "Yes," he said, "I am." That was all. But she felt it the way she felt things he said simply all the way through, without having to translate it into something more elaborate to understand it. She taught through January. She told Aldrich in December, matter-of-factly, and he received the information with the slightly stunned quality of a man who was not sure of the protocol and was trying not to show it, and she suggested that she would teach through April, and that perhaps they could begin looking for someone to cover the spring term, which she would help train. Aldrich said he would see to it. He also said, after a pause, "The school will be here when you're ready to come back." She looked at him. "We're not going to look for someone permanent," he said. "We're going to look for someone temporary." He pushed his glasses up his nose. "Patience is going to need you next year. She's outpaced what I can offer her. Came back in the fall. Marin Hale was born in April. On a morning that started like any other morning and escalated faster than anyone had planned, and Ruth Hobbs delivered her with the calm efficiency of a woman who had done this before and trusted the process, even when the process was alarming. And when it was done and Elowen was holding a small red-faced person who had no interest in the worlds outside her own furious arrival, Ronan was there, having come in from the field when Ruth sent Samuel running for him, and he stood at the side of the bed and looked at Marin with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something unguarded, something that had no calculation in it, just the open fact of it. Marin, Elowen said. She had decided the name weeks ago and had not said it out loud until now. Ronan said it after her, quietly, like he was testing the weight of it. Marin. Toby, summoned from Ruth's house, where he'd spent the morning, came and stood on his toes to see and said, with the gravitas of a 2-year-old delivering important information, "Baby." "Yes," Elowen said. "Baby. Mine," he said. "Yours," she said. He seemed satisfied with this and went back to the wooden blocks. She lay in Ronan's bedroom, her bedroom, their bedroom, the room she had slept in on the first night not knowing anything about anything, and she held Marin, and she listened to the house. Toby in the kitchen, Ronan's voice low talking to Ruth. The ranch sounds from outside. The wind off the mountains, always the wind. She thought, this is the life. Not the one she had planned, or the one she had earned, or the one that had been promised to her. Just the one that had happened, assembled from disaster and stubbornness and the help of people she had not known a year ago, and the choice, made in the dark, in a storm, to trust a stranger's hands with her child for 30 seconds while she mounted a horse. It was not a clean life. It was not going to get clean. There would be more hard winters and more trouble with the school board and more letters to write on behalf of students like Nolan, and Marin would grow up and find her own difficulties, and Toby would find his, and there would be years that took more than they gave, and years where the accounts balanced, and years where something unexpected broke something she'd thought was solid. She knew all of this. She held Marin against her chest, and she listened to the house, and she thought, I know what I am now. That was not true in September of last year. It had not been true in the 14 months of her marriage. She had been performing versions of herself for audiences she was trying to satisfy, and none of the performances had been the right size or the right shape, and she had not understood that the problem was the performing rather than the versions. She was Alhawan Hale. She was a teacher, and a rancher's wife, and a mother of 2, and a woman who had been abandoned in a storm with nothing, and had built something from the nothing by the incremental and unglamorous method of doing the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the thing after that. She was a woman who had learned that accepting help was not the same as being weak, and that being alone was not the same as being strong, and that the difference between needing someone and being owned by them was everything, and that it was possible to love someone and remain yourself, as long as the someone in question wanted you to remain yourself, and would tell you, plainly, when he thought you were making a mistake, and would listen plainly when you told him the same. She was not finished. She was nowhere near finished. She had come to understand the point. Outside, across the yard she could not see from the bed, the broken wheel hung on the gate in the April afternoon, gray and warped and imperfect, marking the place where one thing had ended and everything else had begun, not a monument to survival, not a trophy, just a fact, a wheel that broke, a woman who kept going, a life that was entirely, stubbornly, irreducibly her own. The wind came down off the mountains. She held her daughter, and she listened to it, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she did not brace against it. She just let it come,